Lorraine lived like the main character. The sun simply shone on her golden curls. Every day, she blinked her light green eyes. Everyone admired her. The servants greeted the young lady with joyful smiles every day. Lorraine, in turn, greeted them with a radiant smile on her face. She was like an angel who came down from heaven. She was everyone's favorite. A moment later, the young lady frowned and looked away. She saw Sienna, and with the speed of lightning, her face changed. With a radiant smile, she greeted her. Lorraine was her whole world. Sienna smiled and greeted her sister. She hoped that she loved her too. Sienna loved her sister very much until she found out her true face. The young lady looked at her with a smirk and said that she hated her with all her heart, so much so that she wanted to kill her. The young lady looked at her sister in surprise and asked if she had imprisoned her because she was afraid of being caught for her crimes. Lorraine said that was not the main reason. With a smirk, she told the lady that no one would save her. Sienna knew perfectly well that it was hard to deny that everyone hated her. She was shocked because she believed her sister. Lorraine looked at her and said with a smirk that she could kill her with her own hands. She told her sister with a joyful smile that she was very happy now. Sienna took a bottle out of her secret pocket and asked if she was celebrating her victory too early. Lorraine was shocked. She didn't understand where the girl got something like that from. Sienna smiled and asked her sister for forgiveness, as she couldn't let her kill her. Lorraine was in shock and screamed with rage because everything was not going according to her plan. She screamed furiously that the girl must die the most miserable death possible. She could not allow her to die so easily. Sienna looked at her sister with a smirk and said that she had big plans. Unfortunately, the young lady knew that no one loved her in this life. She wondered if it was good that in the last seconds, she did what she wanted. That's how she met her sad end. When she opened her eyes, she realized that she had simply thought that this was the end. She never thought that she could go back in time and start all over again. She sighed heavily as she realized that she was faced with a harsh reality. The man looked at all the children and said that they were wizards and had a duty to protect the empire. He said that for this reason, they fed and clothed them, and that is why the archduke would come to them today. He looked at all the children intently and asked if they understood him. The children said in unison that they all understood. The young lady froze in place in surprise and shock as she realized what was happening. The orphanage was different from all the others in that it raised future wizards. From the first day of its existence, the empire fought against demons. Even orphans served as protectors in noble families if they could use magic. In fact, she and Lorraine were not real sisters. They were just sworn sisters. The young ladies both served the Nacht family for many years, but the attitude towards them was different. DGO Nacht, the founding family that provided for them and their sister, one of the three shields of the empire. Their family was very noble. She sighed heavily, knowing she hadn't done much, but she thought it was probably beyond her power. All the nobility looked at the young lady with disdain. They said that she was simply ridiculous and not good enough. She was compared to her older sister, the count's daughter Lorraine. She was very kind and nice, and also supportive. The young lady fell before the duke in her past life, and then he said that he chose her. At that moment, she was very glad that she was not scolded, as had happened before. Then she was very happy and did not understand the meaning of all the words. Now she understood that it was stupid. Sienna knew she had to keep a low profile to avoid being caught by the duke's family. A moment later, she was taken aback and threw all her thoughts away as they were informed that the archduke had arrived. The young children stood in a line, and the duke in turn walked slowly past the children. Roderick Nacht, the head of the Nacht family, the duke looked closely at all the children. The young lady froze in place. She knew she had to remain calm. She knew she must not fall under any circumstances. Sienna understood that she had to stand. He slowly approached her. Sienna calmed herself. She knew that everything would be fine, and she just needed to wait and it would all be over. She closed her eyes as she heard his footsteps getting closer. A moment later, the duke approached the young lady and froze for a moment. She was in shock and told herself that this simply couldn't be happening. She said that it was just a coincidence. All those present looked at the duke intently and in surprise, as they did not expect to see such a thing. The duke knelt before the young lady and asked if she would go with him. The lady in turn froze in place from shock and surprise. She did not expect anything like this. Looking at the duke, goosebumps ran across her body. She felt the powerful magic that emanated from the duke. The world fought against evil even after the war. Archmages are important people in the empire, ready to defend the empire at any moment. For this reason, wizards were properly trained from childhood, even if they were ordinary people. Sponsors are a great opportunity to enter high society. After all, marriages between the children of defenders and those who protect are very popular. So, aristocrats can create a lineage. She knew that her guardian and Lorraine were quite influential people. They were part of the highest class of signs. The Euro clan protected the sky, the Parado clan protected the sea, and the Knot clan protected the earth. She did not understand why such a man bowed his knee before her. He asked the girl what her name was. She looked at the Duke intently, as she did not want to answer him at all. Someone present touched her, because he saw that she was lost in her thoughts. After bowing, the young lady introduced herself and said that she was very glad to meet him. The Duke looked at her intently and asked if she wanted to go with him. Sienna looked at the Duke intently and wondered if he would ever call her by her first name, affectionately. She didn't understand why he was asking her to go with him. She knew that for her, that place was like a cemetery. A moment later, the young lady collapsed to the ground with a severe headache. He looked at her in surprise and called out to her, asking if she could stand up. She knew she should refuse, but unfortunately, she could not open her mouth. She pulled away from the Duke. A moment later, she collapsed to the ground, the Duke frozen in place in shock. After she fell, there was a scream. Everyone was surprised, as they did not expect to see something like this. She opened her eyes for a moment and wondered why she saw concern on his face. The young lady, in turn, wondered if he was worried about her. She sighed heavily because she knew that she was most likely wrong. She didn't like all of this. Lorraine greeted the young lady with a beaming smile. Sienna bowed and told the young lady that she was very pleased to meet her. Lorraine ran closer to the lady and said with a smile that from now on, she could call her sister. She looked at her closely and said with a smile that she had always wanted a sister. Sienna was surprised, as she herself was from an orphanage and never had any relatives. Lorena said with a smile that she promised to consider her family, so the young lady became her sister. Lorraine came into the lady's room with a smile and said that she had brought tea and sweets. She smiled and asked if the girl would like to go with her to the estate in the summer, as her parents had been asking about her. Sienna was a little surprised, as she didn't expect to hear something like that. She happily agreed, and they went to the estate. They were together almost all the time. Madame looked at the young lady intently and greeted her. Sir also thanked her with a smile for being friends with their daughter. Lorraine continued to look after her sister. Sienna was surprised, but at the same time happy about such care. The lady looked at her friend and said that she would like to give her a doll. Sienna asked with a surprised smile if she could take her. She saw that Lorraine and her parents treated her very well. Late in the evening, a young lady came to her room. She quietly asked if she was sleeping. Sienna looked at her in surprise, as she did not expect to see her late at night. Lorena smiled and said that she would like to do something with her. Sienna looked at her sister in surprise and asked what she was talking about. The young lady handed her a small book and said with a smile that she would like to do something with it. The young lady looked closely at the book that sister showed her, as it looked very ancient. Lorraine asked her sister if she would read a book with her. Lorraine said with a smile that the book described how to share magical power with another person. The young lady in turn was very surprised, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. Lorraine stroked her sister's head with concern and said that she would like to share her power with her. She looked closely at her sister and said with a worried expression that she felt like she had no power. Sienna was surprised. She didn't expect to hear anything like that addressed to her. She thought that the Duke chose her because she had magical powers. She wanted to become a powerful archipelago so as not to be a burden. The young lady looked at her sister with a smirk and said that everything was fine since she had a lot of strength. Sienna sighed heavily but firmly refused her sister. She looked at her closely and said that it was just a trick and she couldn't do it. Lorraine took her sister by the hands and asked if she really wanted to go back to the orphanage. The young lady did not answer the question. She looked at her intently and said that she just wanted them to continue being sisters. In the end, they performed the ritual. Lorraine said with a grin that it would be their little secret. Lorraine looked at her beloved sister with a smirk and said that she would not tell anyone anything. Now she understood that trusting and expecting something from someone was very naive. Now she was sure that when she returned in time, she would never get involved with her. She wanted to leave everything in her past life and not return to such an outcome. She knew that if she woke up, she would simply go back to that quiet life. Opening her eyes, she saw the Duke in front of her. He was telling some people to repent while they awaited punishment. The man shouted at the Duke. He said that it was not his fault. The young lady froze in place. She did not understand what was happening. The Duke looked at the man intently and told the knights to take him away. A few minutes before the young lady woke up, something happened. The Duke looked closely at the young girl, for it seemed to him that she had fainted when she refused to take his hand. He thought that it was most likely some kind of mistake. It seemed to him that she was simply overexcited, since she had never seen anyone like this before. He looked at her intently, as if he knew that even though she was an orphan, she was too thin. The Duke realized that she was definitely underfed compared to the other children. He knew that the orphanage allocated huge sums of money to raise special children. He knew that this place could not be poor. The directors also knew about this, but unfortunately, such people often profited from it. The young lady woke up and looked at her teacher in surprise. The Duke said that not many children have the potential for magical abilities, so military children are a resource for the Empire. He looked at the director with fury and said that he could not harm them or exploit them in any way. The Duke looked at the director with fury and said that he was not fit for this position, and he could repent while he awaited punishment. The director was in shock. He knew that it was all because of the girl who fainted. He shouted to the Duke to wait. Looking at the Duke, he shouted that he was not at all to blame for what had happened. The Duke looked at the director with fury, but at the same time told him to take him away immediately. The director shouted angrily that the orphanage was his private property. The young man looked at the butler and told him to stop. The young man told the director that if he did not shut his mouth, he could lose not only his private property, but also his life. A few minutes later, everyone was staring intently at the director as he was led away by the arms. The young lady looked at the Duke in bewilderment, as this had not happened in her past life. She knew his cold gaze, but now she didn't understand why he looked at her like that. The young lady was taken aback and wondered if he was unhappy that she had fainted. She wondered if he didn't want to take her anymore because she was weak. She knew that if that was the case, then this was her chance. The young lady, with the speed of lightning, hugged her teacher and cried out that she was very scared. She wanted to pretend to be vulnerable. Sienna asked if she could not go. She said that she would be good. There would be less. She would take care of the other children and listen to the teacher. The Duke and his subordinate froze in shock. They did not expect to hear such a thing. The teacher sighed heavily and told the Duke that she was just a child and that she was simply afraid to leave because everyone loved her here. The teacher said she would try to persuade her, "I whine lady." Sienna was not going to give up. She burst into tears and shouted that she did not want to leave. She was surprised because she only wanted to pretend to pay, but in reality, she burst into tears. The teacher was in shock. The man looked at the teacher and said that the child would be even more frightened if she started crying too. The man looked at the Duke and said that he was sure that the Duke would not take the child against his will. He quietly told the Duke to repeat it. Sienna, in turn, looked sideways at the Duke as she awaited the verdict. The Duke looked at her intently and agreed, and in an instant, she stopped crying. She looked at everyone present and wondered if she could calm down now. It sighed heavily and wondered if it had really been that obvious. The Duke looked at the girl and wanted to say something, but she began to cry loudly again. Everyone froze in surprise as they did not expect to see something like this. A moment later, the Duke turned around and said that that was enough for today and that it was time for them to return. She was happy and wondered if she had really succeeded. She hoped that she would not have to go with him anymore. The teacher looked closely at the young lady and said that everything would be fine now. Looking at the teacher, she understood that although she had created such a scene, she looked at her with warmth. The teacher smiled and gently stroked the young lady's head, but said that there was no need to cry anymore, as she had a very beautiful face. Now she realized again what Sister had shown her. She understood that kind words and a sweet smile were just a cunning plan. Besides the fact that she planned to kill her out of hatred, she then realized one more thing. Lorraine looked at her sister with a smirk and contempt. She was glad that she would soon die. She looked at her intently and asked permission to ask something. Sienna looked at her and asked if she remembered that summer at the estate. She asked if it was really true that she wasn't the one who received magical powers back then. The young lady in turn looked at her sister with a grin. She thought for a moment, but a moment later, she asked her sister with a satisfied smile if she had really just realized this. Lorraine looked at her with disdain and insulted her. Now she realized that she had spent her whole life in her fake love, but she truly loved her smile. The teacher looked closely at the young lady and asked what she was thinking about. The teacher was a little worried and asked the girl if she was still scared. Sienna thanked her for her help. She knew that if she had stayed with her teacher in her past life, her life would have been much better. The governess looked closely at the girl as she saw that she was still pale, but she knew that she must let her go with the Duke. A moment later, the director burst in on them. He was furious. The teacher looked at the director in surprise as she did not expect to see him. The lady was shocked as she did not understand what he was doing here. The director was yelling at the young lady, and he couldn't just let it go. He ran closer to her and grabbed her by the hair in anger. He shouted and insulted her. The teacher quickly rushed to the director and asked him to calm down. He pushed her away in anger and hit her. He shouted that she should get out of the way. The teacher fell to the ground with a crash. He looked at the young lady with anger and said that his property had been taken from him and it was all her fault. He shouted that he would immediately sell her into slavery. She froze in shock. The young man looked at the director with anger and said that he should immediately take his hands off the girl. The director looked at the young man in surprise. He did not expect to see anyone. A moment later, the young man angrily struck the director. He fell to the ground with a thud and passed out, leaving the young lady frozen in shock. She looked at the young man intently frozen in place. The young man in turn looked at the director with fury. He was very angry. She froze in surprise as she saw before her the young Archduke Aesel, the eldest son of Duke Nock. She looked at him intently, knowing that he didn't often show his emotions. Moments later, the Duke himself entered the room and looked closely at everything that had happened. A few minutes later, the director was dragged along the ground. She looked at them intently because she knew that this was not for Lorraine's sake. Something terrible could happen to the director. She froze in surprise because she did not understand why everything happened this way. She could not do anything. She looked intently at the Duke because she understood that everything had been resolved, as if by magic, because he appeared here. Now she felt like she was a child cared for by the Nocts. She sighed heavily because she knew that she was simply helpless. A moment later, the teacher ran up to her and called her. She was very worried. She hugged the girl tightly and said that she seemed to be very scared, but did not even cry. The young man looked at the young lady and said that he thought she was still in shock. He looked at the Duke intently and said that it might not be safe to stay in the shelter. The Duke looked at the young lady and called her by name with tenderness in his voice. He sighed heavily and said that he would ask her again. He slowly extended his hand to the colony and asked if she would go with him. She froze in place, not knowing what to answer. She looked at the Duke as if enchanted, because it was the first time she had seen such an expression on his face. She knew that this was a shadow of emotion. She wondered if she was stronger than she thought. She realized that he had seen through it and taken her away. She understood now why he was disappointed. They all said that there was no point in taking care of her since she was an ordinary child, and Lorraine was a genius. But in the end, the Duke insisted on his own and left everything as it was. She thought that her powers actually belonged to her sister. She deceived the Duke. Then she was grateful that he did not kick her out. She felt very guilty towards them. Sienna tried to do the best she could. Lorraine told her sister she tried well, and the handwriting was almost illegible. She asked her sister with a satisfied smile if she could write for her raw. The lady in turn had already suffered injuries from the letter, but she still agreed with a smile. Lorraine asked her sister to braid her hair once she was finished. The young man looked at her intently and said that he understood that she was trying very hard, but it was all useless. She froze in place in shock and stared at his angry expression. With the speed of lightning, he left her company. She knew that he was right, for she was useless. She lost her value and sister took care of her, and then the Duke imprisoned her. She understood perfectly well that she had to change the future immediately. She knew that if everything got out of control, she would be in trouble. But if you stay at the shelter, a new director will come to them, and she has no guarantee that he will be kinder than the previous one. Sienna knew this could all end in slavery or worse. She knew that if she went to the Duke's house, she would meet Lorraine after a while. She could not face the traitor who loved with all her heart. However, now she understood perfectly well that she had changed very much in the other direction. Sienna was confident that now she would not be betrayed again, as in her past life. She looked at the Duke intently as she considered his proposal. She knew that at 15, she could enter the military academy. Sienna understood perfectly well that she needed to hold out until then. She was very upset because she understood that in this case, she would have to part with the teacher. The governess looked closely at the young lady and asked with a smile if she liked the Duke. She looked at the teacher but said nothing. The teacher smiled and apologized for not being able to protect her. She looked at the girl with a smile and told her to take advantage of the opportunity and go with the Duke. She froze for a moment, not knowing what to answer. Asil looked at the teacher and asked if she would like to become the new director of the orphanage. They froze in shock as they did not expect to hear anything like that. The young man smiled and said that it was a very good idea since the shelter was close to the estate, and it would be very convenient. The Duke looked intently at the young lady as he waited for her answer. Sienna thought for a moment as she was delighted with this news and wanted to stay at the shelter. She knew that this would be her condition for joining the family. After a long conversation, they decided to go back home. The teacher looked closely at the young lady with a smile and asked if everything was okay with her. The young man glanced sideways at the young lady as he saw that she was upset. He knew it would be wonderful if she were treated with love. He quietly whispered to the Duke to stop in front of the carriage. He told the Duke to take the young lady into his arms immediately. A moment later, the Duke followed his assistant's advice. Sienna, in turn, hugged the teacher tighter. She smiled and said, "Young lady, that she could go now." The young lady, in turn, hugged the teacher even tighter. The teacher was surprised, as she had never done anything like this before. She looked at the Duke and apologized for being rude. The teacher looked at the young lady closely and said that she had promised her something. Sienna looked at the teacher in bewilderment. The teacher smiled softly and said that she would visit her often, so she should not worry. She smiled and told the girl to behave very well, and then the Duke would definitely love her. She told the young lady to be sure to be happy. Sienna, in turn, thanked the teacher with a smile for her care. Some time later, they were riding quietly in a carriage. She wondered if she should thank them for saving her. She looked at them intently, not knowing what to do. She sighed heavily and looked out the window, knowing she shouldn't have done so because she was too tired. Sienna knew that now she didn't want to try and behave well at all. The Duke looked closely at the lady and asked if she was asleep. He slowly picked her up in his arms, and a few minutes later, they entered the house. He told everyone to be quiet because the baby had fallen asleep. Asil looked at his father and said that he could carry her. The Duke sighed heavily and refused his son. He said that everything was fine. He looked at his father and said that the butler had already prepared a room for the lady. The Duke looked at his son and asked if he had nothing to do. Asil said with a smile that everything was fine, but in reality, he knew that he really had a lot to do. He looked intently at the young lady, for he did not at all understand why he could not leave. Moments later, the boy called out to his father, and they both looked at her intently. The second son of the Nacht family, little Lord Michael, he looked intently at his father, who was carrying the lady in his arms. He looked at his father in surprise, as he did not expect him to bring a child with him. The Duke looked at us sideways and said that the child was not like him, and asked his son to be quiet. Michael was very surprised, and at the same time angry with his father, because he did not explain anything. He looked at his brother and asked how old she was, and if she would stay in their house. Asil looked at his brother and said that she was only a year older than him. He sighed heavily and said that it looked like the second question, the answer was yes. He asked his brother if she would stay with them. In any case, Asil said that the young lady would stay. The Duke slowly laid the young lady on the bed. He looked at her intently. Asil looked at his brother and father. He noticed that they were acting differently. He also acted differently, but he didn't understand why. When he saw that someone was hurting her, he couldn't contain his anger. He sighed heavily, as the very thought of it was driving him crazy. He didn't understand what was happening to him at all. Michael looked at his brother in surprise. The Duke glanced sideways at his sons and told them to go out and let her rest. Asil looked intently at the young lady, who was sleeping quietly in bed. He knew that this time he would definitely be able to protect her and would do everything possible. The young lady fell asleep with the speed of lightning. She was sleeping peacefully when she suddenly heard someone calling her. Her eyes froze in place, as if rooted to the spot, as she did not understand where she was. A moment later, she suddenly heard someone clearly calling her, and she turned around in a hurry. She froze in surprise as she saw Lorraine calling her angrily. Lorraine looks at her with anger. She screamed that she hates her. Lorraine looked at her sister with fury and a smirk and asked if she was happy with taking her place. She shouted at her to answer the question. The young lady, with her lightning speed, woke up from a terrible nightmare. She sighed heavily, as she knew that it was just a dream. She froze in surprise, as she was in an unfamiliar room. For a moment, she remembered the moon cradle. Looking around, she realized that it was the room in which her sister lived. The maid looked at the young lady and said that this was her room. Sienna was a little surprised, but said nothing. She was happy because she finally had her own room. Lorraine hugged her sister tightly and invited her into her room with a smile. She said that she was already imagining her. She smiled and said that this was the moon cradle, after the rooms of the archduke and his sons. She smiled and said that this was the best room. The maid looked at her and said that there was also a separate room for servants. The lady smiled and said that it suited her. She told her sister that she could come and play with her, and that she could also spend the night in her room. Lorraine really wanted a moon cradle, and the Duke agreed. She looked at her sister with a smirk, as she was glad of this opportunity, so she began to live there. Sienna sighed heavily and slowly got out of bed. She knew that she should not be placed in such a room. She knew that the servant's bed there was bigger than the one in her room. She knew that she had been brought here asleep. Memories from the dream suddenly came flooding back to her. Lorraine, with a fierce grin, asking her if she was happy that she had taken her place. She sighed heavily, as she knew she would not be competing with her sister at all. She thought that she would quietly wait out a few years and then enter the military academy. She knew she would be misunderstood if she stayed here. She walked slowly down the corridor in search of her room. She knew she had to get back to the room before anyone noticed her. She kept turning around to see if anyone was following her, and unfortunately, she accidentally tripped and fell. She froze for a moment because she had hurt her leg. She knew that she couldn't stop and needed to move on. A moment later, she finally managed to find her old room. She walked slowly and lay down on the bed, as she knew that she needed to cover herself first, as the night was very cold. She quietly covered herself with her blanket and slowly fell asleep. The head maid walked slowly towards the young lady. She knew that she had to serve the future archduchess. The man told her that the Duke had brought someone who needed to be taken care of. She smiled and asked if he had brought the future duchess. The butler said that this was not true. She was just a girl from an orphanage, but she had exceptional qualities. Deborah knew that the Duke cared about her, and that was why he had ordered her to be placed in the moon cradle. She slowly knocked on the door. She was puzzled, as no one answered her. The maid entered the room with lightning speed. She froze in shock and surprise as she saw that the young lady was not in the room. She sighed heavily and said that they had searched the entire estate up to the library, but still hadn't found it. She was puzzled, for she knew that she had to report this news to the Duke. She cried out that they must find her, as the Duke had brought her and placed her in the moon cradle. She was in shock, as everyone present wanted to cover up her disappearance. She was furious because she didn't expect this from them. The Duke looked at Madame in surprise and asked how she could neglect her duties, since he had ordered her not to leave the girl. Deborah, trembling with fear, said that she had no excuse. She saw that he was very angry. She sighed heavily, as she realized that the young lady was a more important person than she thought. Falling to her knees, she said that she was very sorry. She said that the services were already searching the house, and they would find her. The Duke sighed heavily and rose from his chair. He said that he needed to go. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what he was talking about. He looked intently at the maid and said that they needed to find the child. The butler looked at the Duke and said that he could simply give the order, and they would look for her. Deborah looked at the butler and said that the Duke said that he would also look for the missing lady. The maids were shocked. They did not expect anything like this. They knew that the girl was just an orphan. They wondered if there was royal blood in her. The butler looked at the servants and told them to stop talking and go search. The Duke sighed heavily, as he knew that he would not be able to find her, even with so many people. He knew that last time she fell asleep because of an ancient, dangerous spell, and he could not let her walk alone. The Duke was furious. He did not understand where she could be. The maid looked at the Duke in surprise and asked where. The butler looked at her intently and told her to be quiet. The Duke was puzzled. He did not understand where this feeling came from. The day he came to the orphanage, he felt very confident looking at the child, whose face he had not really seen. He had a feeling that this was the same child. He had such a feeling now next to the room. He felt with all his gut that she was there, yet he dared to enter. The Duke walked slowly into the room and saw a crumpled blanket. He thought for a moment, as if no one had been there for a long time. The atmosphere in the room was so quiet. He sighed heavily, and looking at the blanket, said that she was definitely here. He saw a cold and dusty room. He wondered if the child had slept under this blanket all night. A moment later, the Duke saw traces of blood on the blanket. He froze in shock and wondered if she was hurt. A moment later, he shouted for more people. The maid turned around in surprise as she heard some kind of creaking in the room. She froze in shock and surprise as she saw that the young lady had been in the closet all this time. She looked at her in surprise and called out, "Sienna," quietly, looked at the head maid. She looked closely at the maid and told her to be quiet, as she had deliberately covered her tracks. Deborah was very surprised, and did not understand why the young lady was hiding in the closet. She sighed heavily and said that it was all because she had suddenly disappeared, and if the Duke found her, there would be a commotion. Early in the morning, she realized what was happening. She woke up in terrible pain. The lady was a little surprised and puzzled. She looked around the room closely. Now she realized that the room was not prepared. She sighed heavily as she understood that this simply could not be. She knew that if they had wanted to put her in this particular room, they would have cleaned it. She knew that a lot had changed. She had not at all imagined that she might be placed in a moon cradle, and the Duke offered her several times to go to the estate. Sienna understood perfectly well that for this reason, if he found out that she had disappeared on the very first day, he would never love her. She sighed heavily because she understood that if she wanted to live peacefully and get along with the headmaid, then she needed to do everything gradually. She knew she had to tell the headmaid that she was in this room. She froze in surprise as she heard someone behind the door. She was surprised because the Duke himself came into this room. She looked around for shelter as she knew she couldn't let him find her here. Sienna knew perfectly well that she needed to hide quickly. She breathed a sigh of relief as she realized he hadn't noticed her. She used this many times when she wanted to be seen. She looked at the maid and told her to wait a little, and later took her and said that she found it. The maid looked at the lady in surprise, as she did not expect her to help her. The young lady sighed heavily and said that it was not so. She knew that it was necessary so that they would not become enemies. The maid looked at the young lady in surprise, as she did not understand what she was saying at all. A moment later, she sighed heavily and said that she understood everything and that it was a good offer. A few minutes later, the maid took the young lady in her arms and they walked slowly towards the Duke. They looked at the young lady in surprise, as they did not expect to see her so quickly. Deborah looked at the Duke and said that the girl was in the closet. The Duke was shocked since she was very close, but he did not understand. The maid said that the lady was injured and that she now needed to treat her knee. The Duke told the maid to give him the child. The young lady quickly clung to the maid. She did not want to go to the Duke. Deborah looked at the Duke and told him not to worry, as she held the young lady tightly, but the Duke insisted that the child be given to him. The doctor looked at the young lady in surprise and said that she had fallen very badly. He smiled and told the young lady that she had done well and also asked if she would like some candy. She smiled and said that she didn't want to. She knew that she was no longer a little child. Before even the maids did everything reluctantly, they gave her medicine. She wondered with a smile if she had not gone back in time, but had ended up in another world. The Duke looked at her intently and asked why she had gone to sleep in another room. The young lady in turn hesitated. She did not know what to answer to this question. A moment later, she said that when she woke up, it was hard to believe that that beautiful room could be hers. The Duke looked at the lady in surprise but said nothing. The butler was taken aback, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. She looked closely at the Duke as she saw his gaze. It was the same as in the orphanage. It was an expression of patience, with a little irritation. She thought he had his own reasons for putting her in a beautiful room. She sighed heavily as she didn't want to talk about it anymore. She didn't want to get involved with anyone on the estate at all. She knew it was just an illusion that would disappear as soon as Lorraine appeared. She knew that the gap between them could not be bridged by talent. When she kept asking stupid questions, people stopped believing in her. She didn't like it at all. She no longer wanted to live like in her past life. The young lady sighed heavily and, asking for forgiveness, said that she would not cause such a commotion again. The Duke looked at her in surprise and asked why she was behaving this way. A moment later, he sighed heavily as he realized that there was no need for him to interrogate her. The Duke sighed and said that she did not need to ask for forgiveness, since it was not her fault at all. He looked at her intently and said that the moon cradle was her room and she should get used to it. She knew he was supposed to put Lorraine there when she arrived at the estate. She didn't know if she should refuse. She sighed heavily, knowing that when her adopted sister arrived, she would be able to move to another room. Sienna knew that if she gave Lorraine the room herself, then she would understand that she didn't want to fight with hers. It was not difficult for her to do this, as she was accustomed to the maid's room in the moon cradle. She knew that she could stay there. The Duke looked at her intently and asked if she really wanted to say something. He looked at her intently, as he knew that in the orphanage, she had behaved like a child. But when she arrived at the estate, who began to behave differently, he knew it would take her some time to adjust. The head maid looked at the Duke and said that the lady had not had breakfast yet. He said that they could bring breakfast to the room. The head maid and her maid carried breakfast to the young lady. She saw that the lady sighed, as if she was worried about something. Deborah knew that the young lady would soon forget her past and begin to enjoy her new life. Sometime later, they entered the room, and she told the young lady that the apparatus had breakfast. She froze in surprise, as she thought that the young lady had gone to that room again. Looking around, she realized that she was not there. A moment later, the young lady came out of the servants' room. She looked at the maid and asked if they had returned already. The head maid quickly approached the lady and said that this was the servants' room. Sienna sighed heavily and said that she didn't know that, because she really liked the rooms. Deborah said that this room was not for her. A moment later, she invited her to breakfast. Sienna agreed with her and walked slowly towards the table. She knew she didn't have to be stubborn. Sienna knew that if she started insisting on the servants' quarters, they would definitely not allow her to live there. She sighed heavily, knowing she didn't have to try hard. She looked closely at the breakfast, as everything looked very tasty. The head maid looked at her and asked if she hadn't slept enough. She told the lady to eat a little and then go to bed. Sienna agreed with her. She slowly began to eat. The maid was surprised, as she knew that they didn't teach etiquette in orphanages, but the girl had excellent manners. The young lady sighed heavily. She was very sleepy. She thought it was very strange and wondered if it was normal that she slept so much. Suddenly she felt dizzy. She sighed heavily, as she had heard it said that children needed a lot of rest. The head maid looked at the young lady as she saw that she no longer wanted to eat. She looked at the lady closely and asked if she wanted to finish her meal already. She slowly brought her a glass of water. Sienna sighed and said that she would like to stop there. The head maid successfully led the young lady to the bed. As she saw that she was very sleepy, Deborah asked her to be a little more careful. The head maid looked at her intently and wished her sweet dreams. The lady did not answer and slowly fell asleep. Deborah looked at the maid and told her to look after the young lady. The maid, in turn, agreed with the head maid. Sometime later, Sienna woke up from a terrible nightmare. She sighed heavily and slowly sat up on the bed. She was puzzled by the fact that she had had another nightmare about Lorraine. It seemed to her that she would always have such nightmares as long as she slept on this bed. She slowly got out of bed and quietly walked to the servants' room while the maid was sleeping. She entered the room quietly, as she felt much more comfortable there. She sighed heavily as the room brought back bad memories. The young lady was walking slowly down the corridor when she suddenly heard the maids talking. They were saying that she was just a gloomy orphan. They said that she always wrote letters, sewed handkerchiefs. They said mockingly that she was like a servant. They understood perfectly well why everything was exactly like that. They said that if Lady Lorraine became a duchess, then she would become her servant. They said mockingly that she seemed to be very eager to become the duchess's maid, but that it was very shameless of her. The young lady smiled and said that she had enjoyed the meeting very much. She was telling her adopted sister that she would like her to go with her. Sienna looked at the young lady and thanked her, saying that she would rather rest at home. Lorraine looked at her sister with a sneer and said that she was very silent and modest, and she would not feel comfortable there at all. The young lady froze in shock, but a moment later, she was taken aback and said with a smile that everything was correct. Lorraine squeezed the young lady's hand very tightly and said that she meant that she was glad to have her always by her side. Sienna looked at her sister in surprise and intently. Lorraine looked at her with a smile and offered to sleep with her. Sienna looked intently at her sister and smiling said that she would be happy to sleep with her. Sienna knew that the young lady was the only one who allowed her to call her sister, who understood her. She helped her stay in the estate, sharing her strength. Sienna was very grateful to her. Now she realized that it was very strange, because sometimes she really wanted to leave to run away somewhere very far away. But no matter how difficult it was, she always stayed by her sister's side. She sighed heavily, because she understood perfectly well that if she had been able to leave, then everything could have been different. She knew that she had been a very naive girl then. She sighed heavily, as she knew she was going to stay in her sister's room. Now she realized that in some time, she would arrive at the estate. She wondered what her sister would think about her. She sighed heavily, because she knew that she did not need to think about such things at all. The head maid looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she was doing in a room like that. Sienna looked at the maid. She wanted to say something, but hesitated. Deborah sighed heavily and asked if she really liked such a room. She told the lady that she would rather sleep in a moon cradle. She was puzzled, and she simply did not have the strength to continue this conversation. The young lady looked at the maid in surprise. She did not understand why she was behaving this way. She knew that the Duke had left after defeating the monsters near the capital. A seal had returned to the academy. She knew that Michael didn't care about her. She thought that she could live quietly and peacefully, but the situation became more and more strange. The head maid looked closely at the young lady and told her to come out quickly. She sighed heavily, as she had not thought at all that Madame Deborah would carry out the Duke's orders so unquestioningly. She sat down slowly on the sofa. She knew that she only had to hold out for 6 months, and she didn't need to think about such things. Deborah looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she was really going to stay in the room and do nothing. Sienna was surprised by this question, but said that it was not like that. Looking at the young lady, the head maid said that she was sleeping in the servants' room again. Sienna looked at the maid intently and said that she was comfortable like that. Deborah sighed heavily and told the young lady that if she was comfortable in such a place, then it was simply an insult to the duchy. The young lady looked at the head maid in bewilderment and asked what she was talking about. She lived in the estate for half her life before she died. She wondered if she could consider this an insult to herself. She sighed heavily, as she could not say it at all. The head maid looked at the young lady in surprise and said that it seemed like she was sighing because she was in such a gloomy place. She looked at the young lady intently and said that she would go out into the sun right away. She said that she would immediately show her the most beautiful places. Deborah, with an admiring smile, said that she was very glad to be able to show her the grounds of the estate. The young lady, in turn, sighed heavily, since she already knew everything, and there was no need to show her the estate again. Deborah looked at the young lady with a smile and said that there was a modest showroom on the second floor, and they could start there. The young lady thought about the head maid's words for a moment, because by the Duke's family's standards, the hall was modest. The Duke's family protected territories, and it was natural that they would take away many treasures, from the grain that grows and takes root in the soil to the mines. She knew it was too luxurious for a simple exhibition hall. The maid smiled and said that the theme of the exhibition changed every few months. Looking at the young lady, she said with a smile that she would now tell her more about everything. Entering the room, she froze in surprise as she saw young Master Michael. She greeted him with all due respect, and the young lady in turn wondered whether she should greet him too. She sighed heavily and decided that she would not greet him. The maid looked at the young lady in surprise and said that she should also greet the young lord. The young lady looked at him intently, as she knew that he could not tolerate weak people. She quickly hid behind the head maid, because she knew that if he saw something like this, he would probably leave immediately. She hoped that he would get angry and leave. Michael looked at them intently and asked if they had come to the exhibition hall. The head maid smiled and said that was exactly it. She would have liked to continue the conversation, but he interrupted her and said that they could go. He looked closely at the young lady and said that he would show her everything himself. Sienna froze in place in surprise, as she did not expect such a thing. She was in shock and didn't want him to show her everything. She looked closely at the head maid as she hoped that she would refuse. Madame Deborah looked at the gentleman with a smile and said that this was very wonderful. She said that the young gentleman understood this better than she did. She quickly pushed the young lady towards the young master and said with a smile that this was a very good opportunity for them. Sienna was taken aback and froze in shock on the spot. Deborah looked at the young people with a smile and said that she was deviating from this. Sienna was shocked. She didn't expect anything like this. She didn't want to be alone with him at all. He looked at her intently and asked if he needed to say hello again. The young lady looked at him intently and greeted him. He looked at her with hostility and said that he would like to advise her not to think that she would stay here for long. She looked at him intently, as she did not understand at all what he was talking about. She sighed heavily, as it reminded her of her past life. He looked at her intently and asked if she understood him. Sienna sighed heavily and said casually that she understood him. She said that she thought so too. Michael looked at her in surprise, as he had not expected anything like this from her at all. She looked at him intently, as she understood that she did not need to argue with him. She knew that there was no need to pretend with him. In her past life, she was hard-working and did the work of a servant. Michael looked at her with fury and contempt. He asked her if she knew what a worthless thing she was and why she didn't leave the duchy. She understood perfectly well what he wanted to hear in all her lives. The young lady looked at him intently and said that he did not need to worry. She said that she understood perfectly well that being a child of the Duke's family was too great an honor for an orphan. She sighed heavily and calmly said that she was going to enroll in the academy when the time came, and until then, if she kept out of his sight. He looked at her with fury and said that he did not believe that she wanted to leave the duchy on her own. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what he was talking about. She was shocked since he himself had recently told her to get out of the estate. Michael hesitated and said that they could talk about it later. She looked at him closely as she saw that he had a strange expression on his face. She didn't understand what she had offended him. Sienna sighed heavily as she had nothing more to say. She knew that if something had offended him, it meant that he would soon leave. Michael looked at her intently and said that she should follow him. Sienna looked at him in surprise as she did not expect this at all. He sighed heavily and said that he had promised the headmaids to show her everything. She was shocked and did not understand why he was holding this admonition. She knew that they could simply go their separate ways. The young lady looked at him intently and asked if he didn't like her. He sighed heavily and said that he could not break his word. She looked at him intently and said that in that case, she would be a nuisance to him. Michael looked at the young lady intently. He slowly showed and told her everything. Looking at her, he said that there were portraits hanging in the corridor outside and inside. He said that these exhibits take them back to their family roots. She looked at him closely as she saw that he was trying very hard and explaining everything clearly. She sighed heavily because she knew that in your past life, among the men of the Duke's family, Michael was the one who was the least adaptable. A moment later, she was surprised, looked into the distance, and saw a beautiful necklace. Sienna froze for a moment as she felt a familiar feeling. Michael looked at the young lady with annoyance and asked if she was listening to him. He was confused and did not understand where she would be looking intently. A moment later, he understood everything and said with a grin that she had very good taste. He smiled and asked if she would like to take a closer look at the exhibit. Michael looked at her closely and said that one of the names of this stone is the Flame of Hesperos. The young lady in turn looked at this necklace in surprise. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really knew nothing about it. He smiled and said that this thing sealed in the box for 1,000 years is an ancient heritage that only the worthy obey. There were 13 legacies in total. 4 of them belonged to the Nachts. 1 belonged to the Duke, the second belonged to his brother. No one knew who the third legacies belonged to. Michael looked closely at the young lady and said that the 4th one was special. She stared at the artifact. Michael said thoughtfully that he heard what they said. Hesperos never obeyed anyone. He looked closely at the artifact and said that he had heard a lot about Hesperos's insubordination and that this was not a fiction at all. The young lady looked closely at the artifact. She didn't understand where this feeling came from, but a moment later, she finally remembered. Sienna remembered that her so-called sister touched the artifact, and it almost backfired on her. That summer when they exchanged powers, she touched the artifact. Then her powerful magic connected with him, and unfortunately, the young lady fell with a crash. And unfortunately, after this merger, the artifact split into several pieces. The young lady then lay in bed for several weeks. She recovered, but miraculously escaped death. Then, she became a hero that even the Millennium Box couldn't withstand. She looked closely at the artifact as she understood that it had then disappeared from the duchy forever. She thought for a moment as the young lady's magic nearly killed her on contact. She wondered what would actually happen if she touched him, as in reality, the power was Lorraine's then. She thought that soon she only had a chance that she might just die. Michael looked at her in surprise and asked if she really wanted to touch the artifact. The young lady was taken aback and froze in place. A moment later, she apologized and said that she didn't dare do that at all. He looked at her intently and said that she could touch it as nothing would happen from touching it. She looked at him with a smile and said that she would not do it and everything was fine. She sighed heavily because she knew that she could not do it yet. The young lady knew she had to find another way. He looked at her intently and said that she was free to do as she wished. A moment later, he cleared his throat and said that in that case, they could continue. The young lady was shocked. She did not expect that he would continue telling her about everything for so long. He slowly led her around and carefully told her about all the artifacts that were in the room. The young lady in turn involuntarily yawned while he was telling his story. He turned to her with fury and looked at her. The young man was very golden as he told her everything, and meanwhile, she yawned. The young lady sighed heavily and did not ask him for forgiveness. Michael was furious because he had tried so hard to tell her everything, and he didn't understand how she could be bored. A moment later, he walked towards the exit and shouted angrily that he had had enough. He shouted that if she did not want to listen to him at all, then they could end it there. She sighed heavily and sat quietly on the chair. Sienna wondered if she should have detained the young master. She knew that she didn't have to do it. Some time later, the maid noticed that the young lady was sitting quietly on a chair. She looked back in surprise, as she did not see the young master. Sienna looked intently at the door and told the headmaid that he had left. Deborah looked at the young lady with pity and said that she must have been very upset. Sienna, in turn, knew perfectly well that she was not at all upset by his departure, but on the contrary, was very happy. The headmaid looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that today was just a beautiful day and she should start getting ready. The young lady looked at her with confusion and asked what she was talking about. The maid smiled and said that she had received a telegram that the Duke would be returning soon. She smiled and said that she had heard that the expedition had been successfully completed, so his lordship would be returning home earlier than planned. She smiled and said that it had been a long time since they had dined together as a family. She said that the young archduke would also be present at the celebration. The young lady sighed heavily and muttered something to me. The headmaid looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she had just said. She smiled and said that she agreed to prepare for the celebration. The headmaid sighed heavily and said that she thought she had misheard. She looked closely at the young lady and said that they needed to hurry. Sienna bowed to the headmaid and said that she was not yet well-mannered. She said that she would like to have dinner alone after classes. Deborah came closer to her and said that this would not happen. The lady froze in surprise. She looked at the young lady intently and said that his lordship was personally arranging this dinner, and the young master was even allowed to leave the academy to attend the dinner. The young lady froze in place in surprise. She did not understand why everything was happening like this. Deborah looked at her with a smile and said that there were also some wonderful snacks and dishes waiting for her. Some time later, the servants were carefully setting the table. The young lady sighed heavily, as she knew that she couldn't just avoid dinner, so she had no choice but to follow the headmaid. She looked out the window intently, as she knew the Mediterranean night was unusual. When she first arrived at the palace, she was so afraid of the eerie atmosphere that she fell asleep crying. Some time later, the headmaid informed the young men that the young lady had arrived for dinner. The Duke looked at her intently and said that it was very good that she had come and that she could now sit down. She sighed heavily and disagreed with him. The young lady, in turn, looked at them intently. She was a little surprised and excited as she saw that they were dressed like knights. She knew it looked very beautiful, and for that reason, she felt as comfortable as Tony. Sienna felt awkward since she was still wearing her clothes from the orphanage, but this outfit was one of the best she had. She wondered if she would be able to walk after this. She knew that even if they did nothing, even if they didn't look at her, she understood perfectly well that she was a stranger here. The young lady sat quietly at the table without making a sound, but a moment later, she was taken aback as she saw pomegranates on the table. She thought that this was a very unusual decoration for the table. She knew very well that the coat of arms of the Duke's family depicted a pomegranate. The Duke sighed heavily and said that they could begin their meal. A moment later, the young gentleman sighed heavily and said that it had started raining very suddenly. He looked at his father intently and said that he was very glad that his campaign was over. The Duke agreed with him, as he knew that monsters were more frightening in bad weather. The lady in turn felt awkward. Since she had to dine with people who didn't want to spend time with her, she knew it would be a good thing if she didn't have indigestion afterward. Asil looked closely at the young lady and asked if she liked the dinner. She was very surprised that he asked her such a question, but still said that she liked everything. He looked at her in surprise and said that she had not even touched the meat. She froze in surprise and wondered if he had been watching her. She looked intently at the young master, as he knew about her immediately having been watching her all along. She looked at him sideways and asked for forgiveness. The young gentleman looked at her with surprise and puzzlement and said that this was not what he meant at all. He said that he did not want her to apologize at all. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and said that she did not need to apologize at all if she did not like the food. He said that if she didn't like something, she could put it aside. She sighed heavily, but did not answer, because she did not know what to do. He spoke his words as if she were a small child who did not want to eat. The Duke looked at the butler and called him. The butler looked at the young lady and asked her to eat now. She looked at the butler and said with a smile that everything was fine. The Duke looked at the young lady intently. He was puzzled, because he knew that everything was happening too quickly. He knew that asking her to move to a place like this, as a lady, was a hasty decision. He looked at the lady and said that she could inform the head maid later, and if she was hungry. A moment later, the Duke gave a signal to the servants, and they served the pomegranate on a plate. The young lady looked at the Duke in surprise. She did not understand what he was doing now. She clearly saw grenades in his hands. The Duke slowly divided the grenade, and the butler gave everyone present a small piece. She was shocked as she saw that the Duke was dividing the grenade that he had picked especially for her. She froze in shock and didn't understand what it all meant. The butler looked at the young lady and congratulated her with a smile. The butler smiled and said that when the Knocks welcome a new member of the family, it is customary for them to eat pomegranates served personally by the master. He said that she should now enjoy the same blessings as this pomegranate. She froze and stared at the fruit and wondered if this was what Madame Deborah had told her about earlier. She knew it wasn't just a garnet, but bleeding flesh, like a wolf pack dividing the leader's spoils. She knew it was just a barbaric ritual. She was shocked as she had never experienced anything like this before. When she was with her adopted sister, the Duke looked at the young lady intently and said that she could take the fruit. All family members present began to eat. The young lady, in turn, slowly took one grain. She froze looking at it. Everyone was watching the young lady closely, their gaze never leaving her. The young lady, in turn, was trembling with fear, as she had goosebumps on her skin. She had a feeling as if she should not be in such a place. The Duke looked at everyone present and said that from that moment on, Sienna was recognized as a child of their family. He looked at her intently and said that now Knight and Nacht's 10,000-strong retinue would protect her. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she was just a little orphan, and no matter what their expectations were, she would not live up to them. Michael was shocked. He didn't understand how she dared to say something like that. The Duke stopped his son and looked closely at the young lady. He said that it was unacceptable for a child to say such a thing. The Duke looked at everyone present and said that he thought someone had told a lot of lies when he was with the young girl. He looked at Madame Deborah and asked if he was telling the truth. The head maid was shocked. She didn't expect to hear something like that at all. She looked hard at the Duke and, bowing, said he could swear she had said nothing of the sort. She said that when he was away, she might have been disrespectful, but since the lady had received the garnet, no one dared say anything. The butler looked hard at the Duke and said that this would be cruelly stopped. He smiled a radiant smile and said that the young lady was smarter than her peers. He said with a satisfied smile that soon everyone would admire the wisdom of her ladyship and imitate her. The maid looked at the Duke intently and asked why he didn't find a tutor for the young lady. Sienna looked at everyone present in surprise, as she thought it was too early for this. In her past life, she only started studying a few months after arriving. The young gentleman looked at his father and agreed with everyone present. He said that education should not be put off. Michael sighed heavily and said that the young lady could study with him if that was what was needed. The Duke looked intently at those present and said that he agreed and would certainly find her a teacher. She looked at Michael intently and in surprise, because this afternoon he had only told her to get out of their house, and now he was so friendly with her. The Duke looked at the servants and said that they had much to do, and they should focus on what was necessary for the young lady. He looked at her and said that she was now a member of their family, and he acknowledged her. He looked at her intently and said that he had no idea what kind of nonsense they had told her, but she should forget about it. The young lady froze in shock, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and said that she should forget what she had been told and that she should not take such words to heart. She looked at him in surprise, as she had not expected to hear such a thing at all. She sighed heavily, as she simply could not forget what had happened in her past life. They all looked at her with contempt and shouted in one voice for her to go back to her place. They said that her efforts were worthless. They said that she had no qualities. She knew that among them, she did not experience what she wanted. She wondered how she could forget about it. Trembling, she told herself that she could forget about everything, but she did not understand how her suffering heart could be calmed after something like this. The very thought made her heart ache. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise and called her. She sighed heavily, as she knew it didn't bother her anymore. She was puzzled as she couldn't breathe. The Duke shouted excitedly and called the young lady. She was in shock because she felt very bad. Grabbing the tablecloth, she fell to the ground. Everyone rushed towards the young lady with lightning speed. The Duke shouted to the servants to call the doctor. He looked closely at the young lady and said that she must wait a little. He looked at her worriedly and said that he was sure everything would be okay. He looked at her closely, asked if she could move. He said that she could lean against him. She was in shock as her body itself leaned against the Duke. She was breathing heavily and could not calm down. The Duke, in turn, hugged her tenderly. She was very angry with herself because she did not want to rely on him at all. She mentally asked him to leave her. She wanted him not to touch her. The Duke, in turn, did everything the other way around. He was very worried about the young lady. As he saw the state she was in, he looked worriedly at those present and asked when the doctor would arrive. She was furious and didn't want him to pretend that she was important to him. She saw his unusual behavior. It was suffocating her. The young people were excited, looked at her, and called her. She was furious because she wanted him to just strangle her instead of being kind. She knew that this estate was just awful. She was furious and didn't understand what she had done wrong in her past life because she had suffered a lot back then. She was furious and wondered why she had to go through all this again. The young lady fainted and cried silently. The Duke was shocked. He called for the young lady, but she did not answer. She knew that in her past life, death was the only way out for her. She didn't expect something like this to happen. The Duke sighed heavily and said that it looked like she had fainted due to stress. He was puzzled and knew that this simply couldn't be true. He was agitated and said that this was just some kind of nonsense. The Duke looked closely at his sons. He knew that nothing like this had ever happened to them. Roderick looked closely at the doctor and asked if he had checked the young lady's condition. The doctor said excitedly that the young lady was in very serious condition due to malnutrition. He looked closely at the young lady who was sleeping quietly in bed and said that there was a high probability that she had eaten something fatty. Asil thought for a moment and said that it was very strange. He knew that she had not eaten so much that it could harm her. The doctor looked at everyone present in bewilderment and said that maybe this was the first time she had been so worried. He said that there was a high probability that she was so upset because she was not feeling well. Michael was surprised that such a sick child with an unhealthy mind was forced to eat dinner. Asil was shocked by his brother. He quickly closed his mouth and did not let him finish. The doctor looked at the Duke and said that the young lady would be up tomorrow, but today she should sleep. The butler looked at the Duke and said that they should let her rest. The butler smiled and said that they would certainly take care of her. The Duke sighed heavily and thanked everyone for the work they had done. The young lady sat quietly on the bed and trembled. She was puzzled by everything that was happening. She knew all the disdainful looks. She heard their conversations. They said that she would simply amaze. They were shocked and did not expect that she would steal from her sister. Several years later, when she was 18 years old, she still could not sleep. She took her sister's powers and now felt guilty for deceiving everyone. She really wanted to wash herself of this guilt. She didn't mind doing the maid's job, but unfortunately, she knew that it couldn't be washed away in any way. She still had the symbol on her body after they exchanged powers. She was puzzled because it weighed heavily on her. The young lady was shocked as she saw that morning had come again to replace night. She knew that crying was a luxury for her. Her sister gave her a couple of tips. She knew she couldn't be lazy now. She wanted to finish the amulet quickly. Sienna knew perfectly well that this was the best thing she could do. The young lady looked closely at her sister and greeted her with a smile. She told the young lady that anyone could do the cleaning. She said that she didn't think it was enough to repay the Duke's family for all the care they had given her. She smiled and said that her young lady should show more sincerity. Sienna was puzzled because she didn't know what to do. Lorraine said with a smile that she could make an amulet. The young lady looked at her sister in bewilderment. Sienna knew that if her sister was talking about that amulet now, it must act as a painkiller for sorcerers. The sorcerer used the element of chaos. They deceived themselves and suffered. Some people believed in the element so much that they turned into demonic creatures. Using the magic of sorcerers, they risked becoming demons. She knew that the amulet was a very important means of protection for sorcerers. She wondered if she could make it with her little bits of power. Lorraine looked at her sister closely and said with a smile that she should show sincerity to the Duke's family. She smiled and asked her sister what she thought about it. Sienna smiled at her sister and agreed with her. The problem was that she knew very little about making amulets. She didn't know how to make them properly, so she had no choice but to follow the instructions. Besides, the only thing she could do with such a small amount of magic was a low-level amulet. She sighed heavily, knowing she had spent several days making the amulet and hoping it would work. The maid looked at the lady closely and asked if she was busy. She said that she wanted to ask her to clean the room of the young Duke Asil. The young lady looked at the maid with a smile and agreed with her. She knew that when she gave the young Duke the amulet, he didn't seem to be very interested in it. She really hoped that it would help him at least a little. The young lady sighed heavily, as she knew it was best for her to focus on cleaning the room. A moment later, the young lady froze in place as she saw the amulet lying on the ground. She was shocked because she didn't expect to see something like this. She slowly picked up the amulet, her hands were shaking, and she was in great pain. She remembered the young man's gaze, which told her he knew she was trying hard. Then he looked at her with contempt and said that her efforts were not worth it. She was shocked because she realized that she was wrong. Now she understood that there would be no benefit from this. The maid entered the room and asked the young lady if she had finished cleaning. She looked at the lady and said that when she was finished, she should go down to the warehouse. Sienna, looking up at the maid, agreed with hers. She was shocked and did not understand how this could just happen. Lord Michael looked at the young lady intently and said that he was very glad that she was not busy. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect to see him. She smiled and said that it was all because she could do something. He looked at her intently and said with disdain that no one asked her to do this. He said that she was so disgusting that she was taking away the other servant's job. He looked at her with fury and contempt and asked why she didn't get out of the estate. The young lady was very hurt to hear this. Clutching the amulet to her chest, she said that she would be more careful in the future. He looked at her mockingly and said that she couldn't just leave here. He looked at her intently and asked if she, in her vain dreams, was not hanging around with his brother. She was shocked by what she heard, as she knew that he had misunderstood everything. She knew it was just a misunderstanding. Of course, she had dreamed of it. She had just dreamed of being useful. She wondered if it was really that brazen of her. Trembling, she asked for forgiveness. Michael came closer to her and mockingly asked if she really felt guilty. He shouted that she was simply shameless. The young lady in turn woke up with tears in her eyes. She sighed heavily and told herself that it was just a dream. She looked at her palms in surprise because she saw that her whole body was covered in sweat. She didn't understand why she had dreamed this. Looking around, she realized that she was again in the moon cradle. She looked closely at the headmaid who was sleeping quietly. The young lady sighed heavily as this room reminded her of her sister. She was puzzled and did not know how she could feel comfortable here. She walked slowly to the servants' room, as it was the only place where she could rest. Michael looked at everyone present and asked if anyone could explain the situation to him. He didn't understand why she was there. The maid looked at the lord in surprise, as she did not expect to see him. She sighed heavily and said that the young lady had a fever and had moved into this room in her sleep. Michael was furious. He didn't understand what the point was in leaving the soft mattress and warm blanket for a room like this. Michael shouted angrily at the headmaid and said that she looked like she was just pretending to be kind to the young lady in front of his father. The maid was shocked. She did not expect to hear such a thing. She shouted to the young lord that this was not so. Sienna looked at the young master intently and asked him to stop shouting. She sighed heavily and said that Madame had told the truth and she had come into the room herself. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really wanted him to believe this. He looked at the young lady and asked if she was covering for the headmaid too. He was surprised and wondered if she was that naive. She sighed heavily as she knew it was all a lie. Sienna, sighing heavily, said that she was not so kind as to protect people who would be unkind to her. The headmaid was shocked by her words. Michael looked at the young lady with fury and asked why she came into the room. She looked at him in surprise and wondered if he was really interested in knowing about it. Previously, he thought that her behavior was simply disgusting. She knew that in a past life, he mocked her and looked at her with contempt. She knew it would be a good idea to pay close attention to this before everything changed. The young lady in turn knew that she now had to remain silent so as not to meet that end again, the tragic end of her past life, which haunted her to this day. The young lady sighed heavily as she knew what was happening. It was obvious that such treatment was not suitable for her status. She knew that this was another step straight to hell. Michael looked closely at the servants and told them to quickly prepare the best room. The young lady sighed heavily and said that this room was the best she had ever seen. She said that this place reminded her of the orphanage she lived in, which is why she never came here again. Michael was shocked by what he heard. He shouted that she was no longer in the shelter. He shouted that she was now a member of their family. He looked at the young lady with indignation and said that she now had a garnet sign on her. He asked if she understood what it meant. She sighed heavily, since of course she remembered this terrible ritual. He looked closely at the young lady and said that it would appear that she was unaware that not everyone could get a garnet. He sighed heavily and said that the explanation was a bit complicated. Deborah looked at the young lord and said with a smile that it seemed he meant that the estate was now the young lady's home. Michael sighed heavily and said that everything was correct. The young lady in turn watched them closely. She wanted to act as if nothing had happened. She would like to get these grenades out of her stomach if it were possible. He looked at the young lady intently and asked if she understood him. He said that this was an exception. She sighed heavily and, looking into the distance, thanked him. The young gentleman looked at the young lady in surprise. The head maid smiled and told the young master that the young lady would gradually get used to the new environment. She looked at him closely because she saw the face he was making. She wondered if he would really think that she would be happy and clap at the word family. She thought that he was very naive. Deborah looked closely at the young gentleman and said with a smile that the young lady needed to change her clothes and rest a little. She said that he could leave the room now. He looked at the maid in surprise, as he did not understand why she needed to change her clothes. He looked closely at the young lady and noticed that she was still in her pajamas. When he learned that his younger sister was sick and had gone to sleep in the servants' room, he mindlessly ran to her. He froze in shock and embarrassment as he realized that the gentleman had burst into the girl's room early in the morning while she was still undressed. As he left, he sheepishly apologized for his behavior and said that it was time for him to go. The doctor looked closely at the young lady, smiled, and said that she was fine, and therefore it was time for him to go too. He smiled and said that she should rest more. Sienna in turn looked closely at the doctor as she saw him for the first time. She knew that the previous doctor pretended that she didn't exist. She felt sad for a moment because she knew that if it weren't for the Duke's order, he wouldn't have examined the orphan. Deborah looked at the lady in surprise as she saw that her expression had darkened again. The previous doctor was fired because he failed to diagnose the young lady's illness. After this incident, rumors spread among the servants that it was wrong to disdain a lady. The head maid thought that most likely the young lady did not know about it. She thought with a smile that she too would like their discipline to be stricter. She looked closely at the young lady and presented her with food. She smiled and said that the young lady should eat and then take her medicine. She smiled and said that she had made her some light soup. Deborah looked at the young lady in surprise, as she did not expect her to eat everything. She asked the young lady if Deborah's devotion had touched her. Sienna froze in place in surprise. Deborah smiled at the young lady and said that she must have some pudding, as well as she had been sleeping for several days and had lost a lot of strength. She smiled and handed her a spoon with some mashed apples in it to make it easier to swallow. Sienna was surprised because the head maid praised her for eating and feeding her. She was very scared and didn't even know if she should eat. Deborah smiled and said it was very sweet and delicious. A moment later, the young lady said that was enough for her, as she was full, but Deborah insisted that she take another spoonful. The young lady sighed heavily, as she was still not used to being treated this way, but she still agreed. Deborah smiled and said that it was a big step. She looked closely at the young lady and said that she had already finished her breakfast. She asked her if she would get up. Sometime later, she was already getting ready for the trip. Madame looked closely at the young lady and greeted her with a smile. The head maid smiled as she looked at the young lady and said that the Duke had personally invited the tailor to come to them. She sighed heavily because she knew that if the Duke had personally called the tailor, then she had to be here. She was puzzled because she really wanted to rest, but unfortunately, no one allowed her to do this. She knew that when someone looked like they fit in with the Duke's family, others were jealous. She knew that you could see the boundaries that others put up, and many other things. But she in turn thought that the Duke would be angry with the one who ruined the festive dinner. But to her surprise, this did not happen. She sighed heavily and wondered why he had hated her so much before. Sienna wondered if it was because she didn't have magic, or if it was for some other reason. Madame looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that she heard that the lady was very elegant. She smiled and said that she had beautiful green eyes and hair and pale skin. She smiled and said that bright colors would suit her. The head maid held out the fabric with a smile and said that the dark color and pattern would suit her too. For a while they were both happy because they knew that they would be dressing her up like a lady. The madam looked at the young lady with surprise, but with a smile. She thought that this was all very strange, since children usually liked compliments. She didn't understand why the young lady had such a sad expression on her face. She was puzzled and decided to push all thoughts away. She knew she had to be careful with her words. Sienna in turn looked sadly at her faded and worn uniform. She saw a pale-faced green eyes and dark blonde hair. She sighed heavily as she was still wearing her old clothes. She knew that anyone who looked at her would immediately know that she was from an orphanage. She knew that there had to be reasons why things were different. She sighed heavily as she knew perfectly well that this was just a funny imitation. She knew that unlike her, the older sister was fit for the job, and she was just a parody of the sweet Lorraine. A lot of strange things had been happening lately. She knew that if she let him know that he knew the future, he would quickly return to his lost life. She stood quietly and humbly, while everyone surrounded her. A moment later, your servant came into their room. He looked intently at everyone present. The young man approached the young lady with a smile and asked if Sienna was there, while he was smiling very radiantly and holding a beautiful bouquet in his hands. Everyone froze in surprise, not understanding what was happening. The young lady, in turn, looked timidly at the young man. A moment later, she came to her senses and said that she was here. A moment later, the headmaid said that there was a card in the bouquet. The young lady, in turn, slowly opened the card and realized that it was a gift from the young duke. He wished her a speedy recovery. The maid looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that the young duke took great care of her. The maids whispered to each other as they thought it was very romantic of him. They knew that one such flower was worth at least gold. The young lady, in turn, looked closely at this gift as she overheard the maids talking. She thought that it was worth a little more. She quickly calculated the cost of the bouquet and thought that it would be better if he gave her all this money in cash, since she knew that if she entered the military academy, she would need money. She knew that apparently he did not replace the flowers, whose value was decreasing with each passing minute, with a gift. She wondered for a moment if this was really the young duke she knew. A moment later, she was taken aback as she realized that Michael had misunderstood her. Then, he told her with a grin that she would not be able to leave the estate so easily, since he knew that in her dreams she was hanging around his brother. She froze in shock and wondered if he thought she wanted to marry his brother. She sighed heavily. Of course, she was very naive then, but she didn't understand what made him think about such a thing. She realized that it was most likely her sister who had given him this idea. She knew that the young lady had stolen her powers and later manipulated everyone. She wouldn't be surprised if it was all true. She knew perfectly well that she needed to get rid of this shadow as soon as possible before she was deceived again. She looked intently at the young man and asked him to tell the young master that she was very grateful for this gift. She smiled shyly and said that there were too many flowers. Looking at the young man, she asked if he would mind if she shared with others. She knew perfectly well that Michael would misunderstand if she received a bouquet of flowers, but she knew perfectly well that she could not refuse the gentleman's gift. Sienna sighed heavily and told her that at the shelter, when they received gifts, they shared them with everyone. She looked at everyone closely and said with a smile that she would like to share her joy with everyone. The headmaid was surprised, as were everyone else present. They looked at the young lady with a smile and said that it was very noble of her. The young lady, in turn, slowly approached each person and handed out flowers. The maids took turns, thanking her with a smile. One maid said that she would decorate her hat with the flower. The other smiled and said that she would dry it and use it as a bookmark. The young lady slowly handed out a flower to everyone. Smiling, she looked at everyone present and said that she only needed one flower and a card. The madam smiled and said that in exchange for such a wonderful gift, the young lady simply had to accept this outfit. The madam told the young lady with a smile that she should have different clothes every season. She said that they would definitely put in a lot of effort to make her skillful outfits. She looked closely at the young lady and with a smile asked her to accept the given dress. Sienna was so surprised on the spot that she did not know how expensive the dress that was given to her was. She looked closely at the bright yellow color and felt like a little chick. Deborah looked at Madame and said with a smile that they were very grateful to her. Deborah looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that she could start school tomorrow in such an outfit. Sienna was a little surprised by this statement, as she did not expect everything to happen so quickly. Deborah smiled and said that because the Duke agreed with her, she would learn faster. She looked at the headmaid and said with a smile that she could now show her the catalog with all the outfits. The young lady looked at the flower and felt sad. She knew that nothing had happened yet, but she knew that the teacher would hate her more than anyone else. She knew that she could not expect a good attitude from him. She sighed heavily, as she knew that the training would start several months earlier, and most likely someone else would come. A moment later, Madame announced the entire shopping list. The young lady, meanwhile, froze in place in shock. She was surprised that they bought her so many clothes. Madame looked at the headmaid and told her with a smile that she had already read the preliminary price. The headmaid looked at Madame intently and with a satisfied smile told her to take the blank check from the Duke. The lady was shocked because she didn't expect to see a blank check. Deborah smiled and said that everything was correct. Everyone was shocked because they didn't expect this. The young lady sighed heavily because she knew that the Duke had a lot of money and could afford something like this. She knew that it was none of her business. She knew she had already adapted to it perfectly. The head maid looked closely at the young lady and said with an admiring smile that she looked just fine. She smiled and said that such a beautiful outfit was just right for meeting the teacher, since he would be coming tomorrow. The young lady looked closely at herself in the mirror. She did not like the outfit as the color was too bright, and the sophisticated style did not suit her at all. But a moment later, she saw that the buttons on her wrists were very beautiful. The robes and silk were of the highest quality. She knew that if she could sell the outfit later, she would have enough money to rent an apartment for 6 months. She felt relief from this situation. The head maid smiled and told the young lady that they could go to the classroom now. Sienna looked at the maid with a smile and agreed with her. Deborah smiled, and looking at the young lady said that she looked like a spring flower. She in turn knew that no one would think about the appearance of armor on the battlefield, but still, she liked to think that she was currently on 6 months' rent. She was very happy because for the first time in her life, she felt so comfortable. A moment later, she froze in surprise as she entered the room and saw young Master Michael. He looked at her closely and said that it was him. He was a little embarrassed when he saw her in her new outfit. He looked away casually and said that he also needed to study. She sighed heavily and threw all her thoughts out more simply because she knew that she had a lot to say now, but it was difficult for her to find the right words. She slowly approached the young gentleman and quietly sat down next to him. He looked at her intently, as if he knew he wasn't a cat, but he didn't understand why she was looking at him that way. He was surprised and asked us if she really had a new outfit. He smiled and said that it was not as old-fashioned as the previous one. She sighed heavily because she knew that this outfit was very valuable, and after selling it, she would have enough money to rent it for 6 months. But if it was old-fashioned, then that was a problem. A moment later, the teacher entered their room and asked for forgiveness. He froze in surprise as he saw the young lord. He sighed heavily and said that he heard that he would only be teaching the young lady. Michael said sheepishly that he was just studying science. The teacher looked at the young man in surprise and said that he understood everything. The young lady in turn looked at the teacher with bewilderment, as she was not entirely sure that this was the same teacher as in her past life. The man looked closely at the young men and introduced himself. He said that he would teach them from now on. The young lady in turn bowed and thanked the teacher in advance. She was a little worried because she couldn't remember his name. She wondered if it was a different teacher. The teacher looked at the young people and said that before the lesson, he would like to ask them a few questions. He slowly walked up to the lady and gave her a sheet of paper. He said that she could write as much as she knew. He looked closely at the young children and said with a smile that they could begin the task. Sienna in turn looked closely at the young gentleman. She found it very difficult. In order to write letters to her sister, she learned to write. She understood that if a child from an orphanage started writing easily, it would arouse suspicion. After a while, she noticed that the young gentleman had already finished giving answers. In that life, she would have been discouraged by the sudden test and Michael's revealing appearance. She knew that now she needed to focus on writing beautifully. She could have said that she didn't know the letters, and everything would have been easier. She glanced sideways at the young gentleman, as she wanted him to stop looking at her, because she was very nervous. She sighed heavily, because she knew that she simply had no choice, and she had to write something. She was in shock, and only now realized that she did not know how to write in this body. The young master looked at her closely, and said that everything was correct, and he also began to prompt her. She was puzzled and uncomfortable, and because of his help, she was really worried. A moment later, she told the teacher that she had already written everything. Michael smiled, and looking at the young lady, said that she had not succeeded in everything, but she still did well. The young lady was shocked as she realized that she had just been praised by a 10-year-old boy. He looked at her closely and said that she had done very well, and that she was now a full member of the family. She sighed heavily as she wanted him to stop this. The teacher looked at the young lady's result with displeasure. He said that fortunately, she at least knew how to write, but he was a little puzzled as he did not understand what she had written. He looked at her casually and, throwing away her sheet of paper, said that she needed to practice to write more carefully. The young lady froze in shock on the spot as she saw his dismissive attitude towards her. A moment later, a man burst into their room and called the young duke. He looked closely at Michael and said with a smile that it looked like he was going to class. Michael looked at the young man in surprise and asked what he was doing there. He said that Michael had not come to class, and for this reason, he went to look for him. The young lady looked at the young gentleman in bewilderment as he had not come to his lesson. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she was looking at him with such a look. A moment later, he cried out in embarrassment that she should not flatter herself. He asked if she really thought now that he was worried about her. The young man looked at the Lord intently and said that the lesson was already over and they could return to the classroom. He looked at Michael intently and said that he was simply afraid that after a couple of lessons, he would forget how to write. Michael sighed heavily and said that he understood everything. He looked at the teacher and shouted at him to teach the young lady carefully. The teacher tensed up as he didn't expect to hear something like that. Michael shouted that the teacher should not teach her the lady nonsense while he was not near her. The young man was surprised. He shouted that Michael was not listening to him. He asked the young gentleman if he really needed to pull his ears. Michael looked at the young man in surprise and asked what the young lady would think of him if he spoke to him like that. The young man smiled and apologized for what happened. Sienna sighed heavily. She was glad that they were gone, and the storm had passed her by. The teacher looked at the young lady with anger and contempt and said that she was just an orphan whose origins were unknown. She froze in shock and surprise. He looked at the young lady with fury and said that she dared to disturb the young duke. She tensed as she remembered his look. Now she realized that this was her former teacher. He shouted at her that she didn't even understand where she was. He shouted that she was just a shameless girl who couldn't even do anything. In a past life, he shouted and insulted her. He said that someone like her could easily disappear. She sighed heavily, so she realized that at least someone had not changed. She knew that it was better for her to see understandable hostility than the kindness of people who would go crazy. She knew that this tenderness was like suffocating silk. The teacher looked at her with disdain and said with a smirk that they would now diminish her confidence. He told her that it was better to think clearly. He said with a grin that the young master was the son of a duke who bore the blood of the great empire. He looked at her with disdain and said that he did not know what mixture was running through her veins. He mockingly said that she was just an orphan. He tore up her answer sheet and, looking at her intently, asked if she understood him. He sighed with a grin and said that it seemed that she could not understand anything since she was an uneducated tramp. He said that the duke was the most important person in the empire. The young lady, in turn, was not even surprised by the same words. She was furious, wondering if she had to listen to the same angry tirades. The teacher looked at her with disdain and said that the duke was a man who saved an orphan like her. She looked at him intently, as she knew that he was also an orphan. She knew that he even joined the army, but was soon discharged. She knew that there was no need to envy him for having to teach an orphan. As he passed her, he said that she should bear in mind that she did not deserve any leniency. She looked at him intently and said that she was very interested in whether every time he spoke about orphans, he remembered his own childhood. The man was furious. He looked at her and asked what she was talking about. She looked at him with a smile and said that drowning people pull water on others. She smiled and said that she thought he was doing the same. The man shouted angrily that she was just an arrogant girl. He grabbed her by the hand and shouted that she didn't know anything. She froze in shock as she realized that she was in trouble. He raised his hand as if to hit her. She knew that if he was not fired after the blow he dealt her, she would suffer. She was already preparing for the blow, but suddenly they heard a man's voice. He looked at the teacher with fury and shouted for him to stop. The teacher turned around in surprise and saw the duke in front of him. The head maid looked at the young lady with excitement and shouted at her to come quickly towards her. The teacher was taken aback and shouted that it was not what they thought. Deborah looked at the young lady with a worried and frightened expression and asked if she was okay. At the same time, the teacher shouted at the duke that he had misunderstood everything. He shouted angrily that the young lady had insulted him first. He shouted that she had said something that he couldn't bring himself to repeat. The young lady in turn looked at the teacher with a gray expression, since he was the first to insult her. Sienna knew that he used very cruel words towards an 11-year-old child. The young lady looked at the duke with horror in her eyes as she saw his cold gaze. She didn't know what he was thinking about now. She wondered if he had misunderstood everything again. She knew that even if nothing significant had happened, she didn't like being put into a dead end by misunderstandings. She slowly approached the duke and quietly took him by the sleeve. He froze in surprise. She looked at him intently. He froze in surprise because he saw in front of him a child who had always avoided him, but now he realized that she was very scared. The teacher, trembling with fear, told the duke that he was not guilty at all. The duke in turn called his assistant to deal with the teacher. He smiled and said that he would fix everything now. The duke told his subordinate to examine the teacher, namely his breathing and liver. and if there was anything unusual, then they should try hard. The teacher was shocked. He shouted that the young lady was just an orphan, and he had to do it. The young man looked at the teacher with anger and contempt and said that the legal status of the guards was still in question. Some considered them servants, while others considered them their children. Devon looked at the teacher with fury and asked how things were going here. The young lady in turn stood quietly and watched everything that was happening. The teacher was shocked as he realized that the Duke's family had accepted the girl as their own. The young man looked at the teacher with anger and said that he must pay for what he had done. The Duke said that he must pay for being rude to his daughter. A moment later, the teachers were led away by the arms. The young lady looked intently after the teacher, but said nothing. The Duke in turn looked intently at the young lady, who quietly let go of his sleeve. He saw that she was very frightened. He understood perfectly well that it would take time for her to get used to this environment. He could not blame the child for his impatience. He thought that she was probably very surprised when she was surrounded by care. The head maid looked at the Duke and told him not to worry. As he left, he looked closely at the young lady and said that she should rest a little. The young lady froze in surprise as she knew that this situation was the most unrealistic of everything that had happened to her in the Duke's estate. She sighed heavily and forbade herself to think about it. Sienna understood perfectly well that she would not get out of here if she attached so much importance to trifles. She didn't understand why he stood up for her. She didn't understand why he was so kind to her. She knew that she wasn't her own, the Duke's daughter, and the flow got out of control, and when it blew up, she didn't have enough self-confidence to resist. The head maid was furious. She sighed heavily and said that the teacher should not have done that. She did not understand how he would dare to do such a thing to the daughter of the Duke's family. She looked closely at the young lady and asked if she was hurt. Sienna didn't want to think about that at all. She sighed heavily because she knew she had something to deal with. She looked closely at the head maid and said that she wanted to ask about the ritual with the pomegranate. She asked the head maid if she could tell her more about it. The head maid looked at the young lady in surprise, as she did not expect her to ask something like that. She looked at the lady excitedly and said that she should not tell her that it was because of this incident. She remembered the words of the Duke, who told the teacher that he should pay for being rude to his daughter, Deborah, sighed heavily, and said that the young lord had already explained that the coat of arms depicted a pomegranate and its cut signified blessing and recognition. She thought for a moment, since this information was familiar to her, and she would like to know more about everything in more detail. It seemed to her that there was something that was not on the surface. She looked closely at the young lady and said that it was actually an old family custom, and that she only knew that because she was an outsider and had not been privy to the details. She looked at the young lady closely and said that if she was really interested, she could ask the young lord about everything. Sienna hesitated for a moment. She didn't know what to answer, as she didn't want to communicate with him at all. A moment later, young Lord Michael burst unexpectedly into their room. The head maid looked at the young lord with fear. She was shocked and asked if he had forgotten his manners. With the speed of lightning, he stepped into the room. A moment later, he froze in place as he realized that he had made a huge mistake. He asked for forgiveness and quickly walked out the door. A moment later, he knocked on the door. Sienna looked at the door in confusion, as she thought that he was just a cat who had been naughty and was nervously knocking on the door. A moment later, he entered the room and, asking for forgiveness, said that he had already knocked, so they should forgive him. He quickly approached the young lady and said excitedly that he had heard everything. He shouted that he did not like the teacher from the very beginning. He did not understand how he dared to talk to her like the last scum. The young man shouted that her teacher was simply an unbalanced person. He understood perfectly well that if he had been there, this would not have happened. The head maid looked intently at the young master, with tears in her eyes, because she knew that he was very kind. The young lady, in turn, sighed heavily, because she saw that he spoke very beautifully. Sighing heavily, she did not raise her gaze to him. She said that everything was fine with her. He looked at the young lady, surprised and puzzled, and asked what that meant. A moment later, he was taken aback and asked for forgiveness. Michael sighed heavily. He knew that he had to be a kind and good brother. He looked at the young lady intently, and hesitating, said that his father had told him to obey. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. He looked closely at the young lady and asked what he would say to him in such a situation. He smiled, looking at the lady, and said that she would study with him from now on. Sienna froze in shock. She didn't expect to hear anything like that at all. He smiled and said that, of course, it was difficult to keep up with him, "But they can't do anything." He looked at her intently and asked what would happen if the same man as the previous teacher came. She was in shock and simply could not believe that she would have to study every day with someone she did not even want to meet. He looked at her intently and told her not to look at him like that. Michael asked with a smile if she didn't want to bother him. Michael said with a smile that everything was fine and the issue had already been resolved. She sighed heavily and agreed with him. Sienna was very confused because she didn't understand what he was even thinking about. He looked at her intently and said that if something happened, she would be calm. She hesitated, not knowing what to answer to this question. He smiled and said that the reaction was correct, and he could do this several times. Michael sighed heavily and sat down next to the young lady. He said that her father would be more careful in looking for someone for her, so for now it would be better for her to study with him. She looked at the young lord intently and said that she could just wait for a new teacher. Michael was shocked. He shouted that this simply could not be done. He said that many people still belittled her and called her an orphan. He looked at her closely and asked if she wanted to show them as soon as possible that she was okay. The young lady froze in place. She did not know what to answer. She sighed heavily and said that she didn't want to do that at all. She wasn't in the habit of building sandcastles where the waves would wash them away one day. She knew that if she stumbled, not only the castle, but her body would be carried away by the waves. She looked at the young lord intently, as she didn't care what they all thought. He was shocked, as he didn't expect to hear something like that from her. A moment later, he apologized for getting angry at her. The young lady calmly and casually said that everything was fine, and he didn't need to apologize. He was furious and asked her if she knew another word other than everything in order. He sighed heavily and told her to forget about everything. A moment later, he told her that they had to start studying. Sometime later, they sat quietly in Michael's study room. The man looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that his name was Seth. He was Michael's main teacher. He looked at the young lady intently and said that he was responsible for the education of the young duke, and now, for some time, he would also be responsible for her education. He looked closely at the young lady and thanked her in advance with a smile. She remembered that it was he who had come earlier and picked up Michael. She looked closely at the teacher as she realized that she would only interfere with the young lord's studies. She saw that he was very good. The teacher looked closely at the young lady and said that if she already knew how to write, then he would teach her magic. She was surprised and did not expect to hear such a thing. She looked at the teacher and the platoon commander. She said that she could read but did not write very well. She sighed heavily and said that she needed a teacher who would teach her to write. Seth was shocked. He did not expect to hear such a thing. He sighed heavily and said that she did not need to pay attention to what the previous teacher had told her. He said that other teachers would come so that she would get a general education, and for this reason, she would learn to write on her own during class. He looked closely at the young lady and with a soft smile said that she should not waste her precious time on this at all. She froze in surprise as she did not expect to hear such a thing. Michael quietly told his sister not to be fooled by the teacher's kind voice. He looked at her intently and said that their teacher was very strict. She sighed heavily and thoughtfully said that she understood everything. She looked at the teacher intently and thanked him. They froze in shock. She would be very happy if he taught her sincerely. She knew that if she wanted to enter the military academy, then this knowledge would be very useful for her in the future. The teacher was very happy. He understood perfectly well that he finally had a diligent student. Michael looked at the teacher in surprise and asked if this had never happened before. The teacher smiled and said that today he would talk about the main directions of teaching. He said that magic is a supernatural phenomenon created by someone who has magic and can use it. He smiled and said that in their world, the magical energy is scattered, and the flow of energy is called dark magic. Sometimes the dark energy gets stuck in the flows and forms the stench of death, and then a monster appears. He sighed heavily and said that monsters use magic instinctively, and this kind of witchcraft is called dead magic. Michael looked intently at the book that was right in front of him. He looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that in other words, people have magic and monsters have dead magic. He smiled and said that if she didn't understand anything, she could ask. He was shocked because he saw that she was writing diligently. The young lady tried hard despite her bad handwriting. The teacher looked at her closely as he saw that she was a very diligent student. The young lady knew that she should not disrupt the lesson by relying on her emotions. A moment later, the teacher became enthusiastic and began to tell everything in detail. Michael looked at the teacher in surprise and asked if he thought he was speaking too loudly. As a sorcerer, he was very vulnerable to the stench of death. The main thing in sorcery is stability. In other words, witchcraft can drive a person crazy and prevent him from becoming a sorcerer. The teacher looked at the young men closely and said that this is what they will both face. They froze in surprise on the spot. Michael thought for a moment and said that it was very terrible. The young lady in turn did not answer anything, but only diligently wrote down all the information in a notebook. The teacher said that of course there is a company of sorcerers pursuing this stability, so they do not need to worry much about this among the magicians. There are healing and purification, highly specialized guides, those people who help other sorcerers use magic. He smiled and looked closely at his students. The teacher said that they should write a summary of their lesson and a summary of the first half of the book. Michael was very surprised. He shouted to the teacher to wait a little. He was shocked because he knew that they did not have enough time for this. The teacher smiled and said that of course they had enough, but they could not cheat. The teacher slowly approached the young lady and asked with a smile if she had had a difficult time today. He said that if there was too much information for her, then she could put it off for a bit. The young lady looked at him intently and said that it was not so, and he told her to write down what he had said today. She confidently said that she would try to do everything. The teacher was amazed. He really thought that she was an ideal student. He was very happy because he now had such a diligent student. The teacher looked at the young lady closely and said with a happy smile that she didn't need to overwork herself, and she could do as much as she could. He said that she was just a perfect and sweet lady. Sienna looked at the teacher with an embarrassed smile and agreed with him. At the same time, young Michael sighed heavily as he understood perfectly well that he had a lot of work ahead of him. Sometime later, the young lady slowly began her lessons. She remembered that the teacher had told her to do her homework on a certain page. She began to study information about the guide. She read that the guide rules the space, declaring it his territory, and he also cleanses it. She looked closely at the book as she was very happy to read the information about the first magic she was learning. In her past life, her sister had taken her power, and she was someone who needed no teaching. She was glad because she understood that now she was at the beginning of her long journey. She was at the beginning of a great journey and an endlessly long path. The young man looked at his friends closely and asked if they were sure that spring was beginning. The young man, shivering from the cold, said that the wind was still very cold. Meanwhile, at the military academy, a letter arrived for the young gentleman. The young man looked at his friend in surprise and said that he should know for himself that the sky is not the best way to correspond. He sighed heavily and said that, unfortunately, he had no choice. He looked at the young duke in surprise and said that he had not received letters from home every day before. He asked if something had happened. The young duke sighed heavily and said that nothing had happened. The young man sighed heavily as the young man's manner of speech reminded him of the duke. He said that they were returning to the palace on the weekend. The young man, shivering from the cold, asked the great master to show him the engineering report. Assel asked his friend for forgiveness and said that he had not yet started doing it. The young man was in shock. He shouted to his friend that he was lying because he had mountains of books on construction in his room. He was in shock and shouted that he had seen everything and that he had no reason to hide it. The young gentleman looked at the young lady intently and asked with a smile if she had been doing her homework for several days. He smiled and said that her handwriting already looked quite good. He smiled and said contentedly that compared to her, he had no ability to study. Deborah looked closely at the young lady and at the young gentleman. She smiled and said that the lady was trying very hard to thank the duke's family. She smiled and asked the lady what other talents she would show. Sienna looked intently at everyone present. She did not understand why they thought this way in turn. She did not answer anything and sat quietly thinking about the pressing matter. She looked at Michael intently as she didn't understand why he was acting this way. She knew that ever since he entered the academy, he had been the best in his class. She sighed heavily because she knew that compared to him, she was just mediocre. She didn't understand who else would need so much transcription to understand a sentence. Sienna, in turn, looked at the entire mountain of books. With a smile, she knew it was great fun, and even though she was a novice at witchcraft, she had still tried hard. She was very happy. The head maid looked closely at the lady, knowing that when she first arrived at the palace, she had only slept and eaten nothing, but now she was engrossed. The head maid knew very well that studying all the time was not very good either. Deborah looked closely at the young lady and told her with a smile that it was very good that she was studying, but still the weather was very fine outside. She asked her why she didn't take a walk in the garden. Sometime later, the young gentleman returned to the estate and was greeted. The butler looked at the young gentleman in surprise and said that he had started coming home so often after his 3rd year. The young man looked at the butler with a smile and said that it seemed that he considered him ungrateful. The butler looked at the young master intently and said that if he was heading to the moon cradle, then everything was in vain. The young master froze in place. He said that the lady should be in the study room. Now she has been studying a lot lately. Asil froze for a moment as he realized that this staircase did not lead to his room, but it led to the lunar cradle. He was shocked as he had unknowingly gone to her room. Just like the last time he hit the orphanage director, now he felt like he was losing control. He didn't understand what was going on and why he was acting this way. He wondered if it was all because of her frightening look, but he knew that her look not frightening at all. He understood that it was a look of disgust. He didn't understand why she was looking at him, and he understood that he needed to avoid her. The butler smiled and told the young master that while he was at the academy, he sent him letters every day to report on the young lady's condition, and then he sent her flowers when he heard that she had regained consciousness. The butler said that if the young master was worried about her, he could meet her in person. The young master thought for a moment, as he knew that he could simply ask. The butler smiled and said that he heard that the lady had divided the flowers among everyone. He said that this was very unusual on the part of the young lady, and he needed to meet her as soon as possible. The butler understood perfectly well that the master must be rational enough to control himself. They said that he was the eldest son of heaven, but when it came to the young lady, he ceased to be like himself. He could not even imagine what other changes awaited the ducal family. The headmaid stood by the window, quietly cleaning, but a moment later, she noticed something surprising. Deborah looked closely at the man as she noticed that he was wearing different clothes, which did not at all resemble the clothes of the duke's servants. She knew it wasn't the postman, but if it was the servant, it was important. A moment later, she saw the young master arrive at the estate. She was surprised, but with a smile, she asked what he was doing there. A moment later, she realized that he was looking for the young lady. The headmaid looked at the young master intently and said with a smile that the lady had gone for a walk. He looked around carefully as he saw that the study room was tidied up and everything was in its place. He was glad that she was being treated like a child of the ducal family. He smiled and said that this used to be his study room, and the headmaid said that it was, and it was the nearest room to the moon cradle where the young lady was lodged. She smiled and said that his table and chairs had not been changed. He realized that she was using his things. The young gentleman was a little puzzled as he realized that he was trying to sense her presence even through such things. A moment later, he froze and looked into the distance as he felt that something was wrong. He froze in shock and surprise as he saw the flower he had sent to the young lady. The flower was not in its best condition and was lying carelessly on the ground. He knew that a simple flower or a bouquet of flowers was a small thing that, if necessary, could be sent even to an enemy. He knew that the recipient was a little girl who had recently lived in an orphanage. Now he realized that she had given everyone a gift from the great lord. He wondered if she didn't know the meaning of the gift. He sighed heavily and realized that she did not attach any meaning to the gift. He always gave things just like that and quickly forgot, but he did not understand why he felt as if his heart was broken. Deborah was shocked. She understood how the flower ended up on the floor. Deborah was taken aback and said that it seemed like she dropped the flower while cleaning. She looked at the gentleman intently and said that it was her fault. He sighed heavily and said that he was not angry with her. She was shocked and wondered if he was really not angry. As he left, he told the maid not to tell the young lady that he had been there. Turning around, he looked closely at the flower that was lying on the ground, and suddenly, memories came flooding back to him. He remembered the medallion that was lying on the ground under the table. He froze for a moment, as he did not understand what kind of strange feeling had enveloped him now. He was puzzled as this feeling was very familiar to him. A moment later, a servant rushed into the room and called the young master. He looked at him intently and said that he had received a letter from the count about Hezeros. The young lady slowly entered the house and noticed that all the servants were running around excitedly. She was surprised and did not understand what had happened. She did not understand what all the fuss was about. A moment later, young Lord Michael said that a letter had arrived from the Earl. She looked at him in surprise as she did not understand what he was talking about. He looked at her intently and asked if she remembered the 13th Hezeros, which she saw in the exhibition hall. Of course she remembered him. The chosen ones used them to fight demons. She knew that this was her way out if she wanted to commit suicide. He looked closely at the young lady and said that, as he had said before, The artifact was named after an experienced sorcerer. Any Max can fight for the right to own Hezeros. He looked closely at the young lady and said that the Earl's daughter said that she wanted to try to get it because she knew that it had never had an owner before. The young lady in turn froze in place in shock and surprise. She wondered if she had heard everything correctly. She knew that in her past life, only her adopted sister had succeeded in this, and no one else. She thought about the Count for a moment. She knew that he, as before, was pursuing only practical gain, maintaining neutrality. Knowing him, she wondered if he would do anything unusual. She knew it was unknown. She knew perfectly well that if there was anything that could change the past and the present, it was her, since she acted differently every time. The Duke's close family circle takes care of the orphan and even presents her with a garnet heraldry. They understood perfectly well that their daughter is no worse, and she will be able to take the orphan's place. She understood perfectly well what the Countess was thinking when she sent her daughter to the Duke's estate. In the past, Gildenach and his wife did not get along with Lorraine. They tried to protect themselves from her. The young man looked intently out the window and asked if his father's bad reputation had disappeared. He knew that this simply couldn't be true. Since last year, Hezeros belonged to Eyeless Getter. The story of the battle with the leader of the demonic creatures quickly spread. The butler looked closely at the young gentleman and said that, however, the position of the archduke's heir was too attractive to hide behind a bad reputation, and whoever was a lord was not the best groom. Assel said that it was not written anywhere that the descendant must marry a child from this family. The butler sighed heavily and said that everyone believed that this position guaranteed marriage. He sighed heavily and said that it seemed to be his fault. The butler looked closely at the young gentleman and said that he was very smart. He asked him what he would do. Assel sighed heavily and said that, first of all, they needed to report this to their father. He knew that it was in the interests of all humanity. He knew that if there was no reason to refuse, then his father would have no choice but to accept them. He meant those who wanted to try to take possession of the artifact. He sighed heavily as he understood that this time they only had one child. The young lady slowly reached for the book. She was trembling because she couldn't reach it, but she knew that just a little bit more and she would get the book. A moment later, she sighed heavily as she was unable to do anything. She knew that not long ago, all the maids, and even Lady Deborah, who had been watching her all day, had left somewhere in a hurry. She knew that now there was a new target in the person of the young lady, and now everyone would run after her. She was puzzled since the new servant that Madame had assigned to her did not even show herself to hers. She sighed heavily and slowly pulled the chair towards her. Sienna knew she shouldn't fall out of it. She sighed heavily because she knew that this was no different from her past life, because in her past life, everything was exactly the same as now she did everything on her own. She slowly reached for the book, but was surprised and did not understand why it was so heavy. A moment later, it fell to the ground with a crash. She involuntarily made a long sound as she fell to the ground. Sienna froze in place and looked around in fear. She knew that this silence was giving her a very strange feeling. She had already gotten used to unwanted attention, and now she was left alone again. She sighed heavily, because this was what she was most afraid of, and she thought that this was the saddest thing that could happen to her. Sometime later, the young lady began reading the book, knowing she needed to concentrate despite her minor bruises. Sienna understood perfectly well that if she concentrated on books and magic, she would definitely calm down and return to normal. Unfortunately, she knew that the hardest pain to heal was that of a broken heart. After reading this book for a long time, she sighed heavily because she was hungry. She was a little puzzled, as unfortunately, she kept forgetting to eat. But she was very happy because she knew where to get food. A moment later, she slowly walked into the kitchen and noticed that there was no one there. She was very glad. She took some buns, as she didn't know when she would be able to eat again, but a moment later she was taken aback and looked at the door as she heard someone enter the room. She froze in place in surprise when she saw the young Duke. He looked at her in surprise as he did not expect to see her. Frozen in surprise, she called him. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was doing there. The young lady timidly said that she was just hungry, and that was the reason she came to the kitchen. He looked at her and said that their family had a lot of magical items and secret passages, so it was very easy to get lost. He said that there had even been cases here where people had disappeared. He was surprised that she was walking around in such a place alone. She sighed heavily and was taken aback as she knew about it. She used a passage called the Secret One. When she worked on the estate, she knew it was a safe passage, but there were rumors that there was a lot of noise there. He looked at her closely and asked if she was hungry. The young master was surprised that the head maid did not bring her something to eat. She said that Madame was busy for this reason and assigned another maid to her. She did not understand why he was suddenly asking her about something like this. He looked at her closely and said that the head maid was probably preparing for the reception. He was surprised and did not understand where the maid who helped her come here had gone. He was shocked because he realized that she had left the child to starve. He looked at the young lady and realized that if she knew where the kitchen was, then this was a normal occurrence for her. The young lady in turn hesitated, not knowing what to answer. He wondered if this had happened because she could no longer tolerate this, the reason she went to look for food on her own. He was furious and couldn't believe that this had happened in their family and in their home. He sighed heavily and said that they should get up first. He reached out to her as if he wanted to take her hand. The young lady said that everything was fine and she would deal with it. She in turn moved away from him. She hoped that he would not be angry with her because she did not know anything. She knew that he treated everyone with coldness. The young master froze in surprise, looking at the young lady. She knew that he had been given many amulets. She hoped that he would not consider her attempts stupid, but she already knew everything. She remembered his face, which was full of malice. He said that her attempts were simply useless. She knew that these were just groundless guesses and blind faith. She sighed heavily and said that he did not need to scold others because of her. He looked at her in surprise and called out. A moment later, he said that they could go to her room. The young lady, without looking at him, said that she could walk there herself. He looked at her intently, as if he was afraid, even though it was just a guess. A moment later, the butler entered the room and looked at the young master in surprise. He looked closely at the gentleman and said that he was looking for him, but he ended up in the kitchen. A moment later, the butler froze in surprise as he saw the lady. The young gentleman looked at the butler and told him to be quieter. He looked at the butler and told him to take the young lady to my room. The butler smiled softly at the young lady and said that they could go as he would escort her to the room. Asil looked at the butler intently and quietly said that the lady was hungry. He angrily told the butler to immediately find out who left the child unattended and deal with it immediately. The butler bowed and told the young master that he would do everything. Asil looked closely at the young lady. He understood that after this incident, he could be sure that he was right. He saw her look. He understood perfectly well that her look was the same as before, not only because of the story of the director of the orphanage. He sighed heavily, as he knew he could only guess why she treated him this way. Some time later, everyone in the estate came out to greet the guests. The young lady slowly stepped out of the carriage and greeted the young gentleman with a smile. She smiled and said that her name was Isabel. She looked closely at the young gentleman and said with a smile that despite their sudden arrival, they still accepted her and she appreciated it very much. The madam said with a smile that her daughter had greeted the young gentleman so nicely that she didn't even know what else to say. Asil looked closely at the guests and greeted them with a smile, but in turn he was a little angry since she had not even arrived when she had already carried away her daughter. He looked at them intently as he was glad that their goals were clear. A moment later, they leisurely entered the estate. The young lady smiled and said that dinner with the Duke's family was a dream. Michael sighed heavily and said that everything was correct. The young lady looked at him intently and said with a soft smile that she was now even more worried about the test. Michael answered the young lady casually. The young Duke sighed heavily as he knew that his brother was simply unbearable. But in turn, he understood perfectly well that his brother was not at all easy. He looked closely at his brother and asked if the girl had really come to take his sister's place. He said that he did not like this at all. Asil looked at his brother intently and said that he would forgive him as the future duke, but still he asked his brother to be a little more reasonable when they would greet the count's family. Michael looked at his brother in surprise and asked if he was sure that he needed to do this. Sometime later, they slowly entered the room. The young master froze in place in surprise as he saw the young lady. In turn, Sienna Tico stood in all her glory and watched the guests intently. Michael quickly ran up to his sister and asked with a smile why she was so early. He smiled and said that it would be okay for her to be a little late. Sienna looked at him as she did not understand why he suddenly became friendly to her. He circled around her for a while with a joyful smile. The young duke looked at his brother intently and with surprise as he saw that he was not just showing affection. He was puzzled as he saw that the young lady and his brother were very close. He froze for a moment and wondered if she had opened up to Michael. He didn't understand why she treated him like that. The countess looked at the young lady with a fierce grin. The young gentleman sighed heavily and said that, unfortunately, they had a late acquaintance. A moment later, he introduced them to Lady Nacht Sienna. The countess looked closely at the young lady as she realized that this was precisely the orphan that the duke's family valued so much. The young lady, in turn, stood quietly and proudly, looking at everyone present. The countess looked at the young lady with a smirk and said that it seemed a little rude to call her by her first name at their first meeting. The countess looked intently at the young lady and asked if she could tell her last name. Sienna sighed heavily, as she knew perfectly well that the countess knew that she was an orphan. A moment later, she said in a calm manner that she had no surnames because she was an orphan. The countess looked at the young lady with a fierce mockery and said that she was very sorry. Michael looked closely at the countess, as he understood that she definitely asked this on purpose. The evening was not easy, although she was prepared for it. The countess smiled and said that they had arrived so unexpectedly, but the reception had still been magnificent. She thanked the young duke with a smile for the warm welcome. Asil sighed and said that this was natural for the owner of the artifact. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that it was not surprising because it was a big responsibility. He looked intently at the countess and said that his father had already decided everything. She smiled and said that she did not expect anything else from the duke. Michael looked at the young lady and asked her if she had tried the dish and if she liked it. He smiled and said that the taste was quite simple, so he thought she would like it. For a while, he also kept telling her to try the rare dishes. Asil looked at the young people with a soft smile. He was glad that his brother was taking care of the young lady. He had always envied his brother Michael, but this was the first time he had envied her so much. He had seen that the young lady had not been able to eat properly before, but now he knew that everything was fine, and he was happy. The young lady, in turn, looked at the young men with fury, since she did not like at all that Michael was so courteous to a simple orphan. She said with a grin that the duke's family seemed to value their protectors very much. She smiled and said that she envied the young lady because she had so many things. She said with a grin that until now, no one had received support from the duke. Sienna looked closely at the lady as she saw that the fire of the count's daughter was burning in her eyes. These may have been kind words, but she was already accustomed to hostility. Sienna quietly and calmly said that she would always be grateful to the duke for his care. Unexpectedly for everyone, a dead silence reigned in the room after her words. She said with a kind smile that she was completely sure of it. Isabel looked at the young lady in surprise, as she did not understand why she suddenly started talking like an old grandmother. Sienna looked at the young lady in surprise and wondered if she had already given up. Sienna knew that compared to Lorraine and Cunning, she wasn't so scary. Sienna knew that her sister had been feeding her hurtful words for almost 10 years. The young lady was furious, as the simple orphan looked at her and sighed. She thought that she was just an arrogant girl. She was furious she didn't know what she thought of her if she acted like that. The lady was furious because she knew that a simple orphan was not worthy of being the duke's protection. She wanted to immediately show her her place. The young lady looked at her with a smirk, as she knew that he would certainly show her where her place was. She looked at her intently, and with a sly smile, asked if she would like to go with her to Hezeros tomorrow. Everyone looked at the young lady warily, as they did not expect to hear something like this. Michael looked at her with fury and asked what she was saying. The madam looked at her daughter and asked why she was saying such things. Isabel smiled and said that her abilities should be superior to her because she is the duke's protector. Isabel did not understand why this should be ignored, and she should be allowed to go there alone. She looked intently at the young lady, as she knew perfectly well that he would not choose either her or Sienna anyway. But she understood perfectly well that then everyone would see the difference between them. She said that in this way, the young lady would feel the taste of shame. The young lady, in turn, thought for a moment, as this situation was becoming even more interesting. She wondered if this was really her chance. Sienna was very tired and wondered if this opportunity would help her end everything faster. Hezaros, an artifact called the Flame of Hezaros, has been locked away for 1,000 years. One of the 13 treasures left behind after a global extinction in ancient times. It was called the Indomitable because it never chose a master. Michael looked closely at the Dune Lady and asked if she knew what Hezaros was called. Sienna said that she knew about it. She was a little excited because she knew that people in the Empire really liked such nicknames. Michael was excited. He told her to read everything carefully. The teacher smiled and looking at the young man, said that if he continued in the same spirit, he would climb on the table. A moment later, he slammed the book shut and said there was nothing more to see in it. She sighed heavily and said she knew it. A moment later, he said he was giving her the book so she could read it herself. Sienna knew that in her past life, her adopted sister had contacted Hezros and absorbed her magical power. She knew that if the young lady was still alive, then the possibility of her death was very high. She knew that, even though it was a small success, she still had to prove that she was worthy of staying in the house on edge. He looked closely at the lady and asked, what if she didn't succeed and Isabel succeeded? He said that then it would turn out that she was a better protector than Sienna. He looked at her sharply and asked, what if she was sent back to the orphanage and Isabel took her place? She looked sharply at the young lord and quietly said that in that case, she would have to leave. He froze in shock as he had not expected to hear anything like that. She thought about it with a smile and wondered how her teacher was doing. At the same time, Michael was barely holding back his anger. With the speed of lightning, he rushed towards her and angrily asked why she was talking about this so easily. The young lady, in turn, froze in surprise on the spot and could not utter a word. Michael looked at her and asked excitedly if she really thought his family would let her go so easily. He shouted that she was now a member of their family, and it was decided. She looked at him intently and quietly said that it wouldn't even be a big deal if she was rejected. He looked at her intently and said that might be the case if it was a sponsorship, but not in her case. He looked at her and said that she had already eaten the pomegranate, and it was a spell that could not be removed. She froze in shock and wondered what he was talking about. The teacher looked at the Dune lady timidly and said that it seemed that the young lord had spoken about this, so in fact the difference was small. There are cases where a power is invested in this custom that becomes magic. The Naktov rite is in fact simple enough to be considered magic. It is not the kind of magic that is performed intentionally, so it is difficult to assess the power of the spell. He looked at the young lady intently and said that it was not a curse, of course, but even if it was only a little. She froze in shock and could not utter a word as she did not expect to hear such a thing. The teacher looked at her closely and said with a smile that this spell would help her live comfortably in the palace where only those born in Naktom could live. Sienna looked at him in surprise, not understanding what he was talking about. He said that this was exactly the case, as strong magic made other mages feel uncomfortable in the estate. He smiled and said that he had already managed to cast a spell on their guests. The young lady froze in shock and pondered for a moment. Was this what her sister had said in her past life? Back then, she'd said that spells should be cast periodically after a diagnosis. The young lady, in turn, was shocked by this news. She did not expect anything like this at all. She was surprised because no one explained anything to her. Now she realized that the Garnet's magic was mistaking her for a born Nocti. Sienna sighed heavily as she realized that now there was no denying the fact that she was part of their family. She wondered if this was a sign that this was the end and she needed to run. The countess was in the living room with her daughter. The countess looked intently at her daughter and called her, but she did not respond. Madame looked at her daughter and told her not to be nervous, as she was already comparing herself to a simple orphan. Isabel looked at her mother with irritation and asked whether she should show the Duke that the girl was not ready or not. The countess smiled a predatory smile and told her daughter that she would do everything in her power. The young lady, in turn, was very worried that a simple orphan could win. Madame looked at her daughter with fury and asked what she was. She said she was furious and could not believe that such a thing was even possible. She quickly approached her daughter and, calming her down, told her not to worry because she was better than a simple orphan. Isabel, trembling with fear and with tears in her eyes, said that everything was exactly like that. The countess furiously told her daughter that she had also become friends with the headmaid, so she did not need to worry about anything at all. She spoke of her daughter, that she would certainly make her the greatest duchess, and she just had to trust hers. The young master looked at the butler closely and asked if he had finished the preparations. The butler said that they had finished everything, and a reply came from the magic tower. He said that the sorcerer who was responsible for performing the ritual would arrive soon. The young gentleman sighed heavily, as his head was hurting from all the fuss. The butler looked closely at the young gentleman and said with a smile that he would be very surprised if any of them succeeded. Asil said that Hezros is a peaceful weapon that should save the world, and if this is so, then everything will be different, since he studied all people to measure their mistakes. But of course, many fail. He sighed heavily and said that unfortunately, sometimes things happen differently. The butler looked at the young gentleman intently, as he knew that the young lady was simply underestimated, and he was too worried. Asil looked at the butler and asked what could be said about Sienna. The butler bowed and told the young master that he knew first impressions could be deceiving. The butler said that they had already sent the news that the preparations were complete, so she would be back soon. He sighed heavily and said that there was no need to check anything else. But the butler looked at the young gentleman with concern and said that Lady Gildenak could not be left alone, as rumors were already circulating. Asil said irritably that he didn't want to listen to them at all. The butler looked at his master with concern and said that they might still bother the lady in the future. He said that the young lady had already eaten the pomegranate, so the land of Nacht would surely help her. However, the young Lady Gildenak was also strong, but if Sienna lost to Tony, no one would think her stupid. He thought for a moment and didn't realize that it would be a shame if he missed it. He really wanted to see what would happen. A moment later, Michael burst into his brother's room. He was on edge and shouting at his brother to stop this immediately. He looked at the young lady and shouted to his brother that she was talking nonsense. The young gentleman looked at them in surprise, as he did not understand what they were talking about. The young lady walked slowly into the room and greeted the young duke. She looked at him intently and said that she wanted to go to Hezarosser. Asil looked at the young lady with surprise and excitement and said that she could not do this under any circumstances. She sighed heavily and said that, unfortunately, she was not up to the task. Before she could finish speaking, he interrupted her and said that she was wrong. Asil looked closely at the young lady and said that going to Hezaros was not an easy decision. He said that Isabel could go there because she was training to become a sorceress. She looked at the young gentleman intently and asked if he had said that there was no need to check anything to go there. Asil looked at the teacher in surprise and asked who I said. He sighed heavily and said that it could be dangerous. The young lady looked at him intently and asked what the probability was. The young master froze in place in surprise. He didn't know what to do. The teacher sighed heavily and told the duke that he was adamant. After thinking, he said that every sorcerer has such a right, and the young lady has it too. Michael looked at them intently and listened to the conversation. He was very excited and did not want her to go there at all. A moment later, he shouted and asked his brother, what if she didn't succeed and the other girl did? He quickly stepped on the teacher's foot and he recoiled in pain in his foot. Michael looked at his brother and shouted in irritation that the young lady had said that if that happened, she would go back to the orphanage. Asil looked at the young lady in surprise. He did not expect to hear anything like that at all. The young lady in turn sighed heavily and said in a calm manner that she thought it would be right. He was shocked and did not understand why she was behaving this way. He wondered if she could really leave them so easily. He remembered the look on her face as she looked at him with disdain. Asil looked at her intently and wondered if she really thought there was no place for her here. He understood perfectly well that from now on, he would have to be more attentive to her. He sighed heavily as he wondered if she had lost the trust she had in him. He sighed heavily and said that he understood everything. A moment later, he said that he allowed her to do so. The young lady looked at him with a radiant smile, as she was glad that she was able to get her way. She walked slowly into the room, knowing that permission had now been granted. She knew that the Count's family wanted to wait for the Duke's return. Sienna knew that they wanted to show themselves in the best light in front of the Duke. The maid looked closely at the young girl and called her. Sienna did not expect that someone would call her. She was very deeply immersed in her thoughts. The maid looked at the young lady with a radiant smile and said that she had arrived just in time for dinner. She smiled and told the young lady that they did not know what she liked, so she had prepared a little bit of everything. The young lady in turn sighed heavily as she saw that she was being fed something again and was puzzled as she knew that she could not eat that much. Sienna was shocked as she had already said this many times. The young lady in turn quickly opened the door and ran wherever her eyes looked. The maid froze in surprise. On the spot, she screamed and called the lady, but it was all in vain. Some time later, the maid walked around the manor courtyard looking for the young lady. Sienna peered out from behind the tree, wondering if she had run far enough. She knew that after she was found hungry, the maid was fired. A new maid was hired for her, and she constantly brought her food, but it was mentally difficult for her to eat. Sienna sighed, because just a couple of days ago, she thought she would die of hunger, and now she was running away. She smiled and thought that life was full of contrasts. A moment later, she heard someone calling her. Isabel looked at the young lady with a satisfied grin. She came closer to her and asked with a smirk how she could be so stupid Isabel told the lady that in her place she would not even raise her head. Isabel looked at the young lady with disdain and said that it seemed she could not expect manners from an orphan. In her past life, she hadn't provoked her so blatantly. Sienna looked closely at the young lady and wondered if she had been rehearsing these insults towards her. Sienna knew it was simply unacceptable to even talk about orphans. Sienna looked at the young lady with a smirk. Isabel was furious. She told the orphan that she could laugh as much as she wanted. She came closer to her and angrily told her to listen to her carefully, since a place in the Duke's family was an honorable status for a person who possessed the necessary qualities. Isabel looked at the young lady with anger and said that this status was not suitable for such an arrogant girl like her. The young lady in turn looked at her intently and said that she also felt the same way. For this reason, she supported her very strongly. Isabel smiled and said that that was exactly it, and of course she should support her. But a moment later, she realized what the young lady had said and looked at her frozen in shock. Sienna looked at the young lady intently and said that she supported her. She looked at her with burning eyes and said that she was doing it sincerely. Isabel in turn froze in shock. She did not understand what was happening and why she was saying such things. Sienna Youngline accidentally dropped her fan. She was puzzled because it looked very expensive and did not understand how it could be dropped with the speed of lightning. She picked it up. She looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that she should work hard and then she would take her place. She slowly handed her the fan. She told the young lady with a soft smile that she would support her with all her might. Isabel was furious at what she heard. Sienna apologized with a smile and said that it was time for her to go. Isabel was furious. She didn't have time to finish speaking before the girl ran away. Michael walked slowly into my room to see the young lady and looked at her in surprise. He asked if she wasn't ready yet. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she hadn't heard the news. He sighed heavily and said that their father had returned to the estate. He said that he would be hosting a dinner party, so she should get ready. Michael said that the Duke had announced that he would be hosting the guests again himself. She looked closely at the young man as she realized that he was the Duke, who had returned half a day early. He smiled and told her Nalady that he would accompany her because father was here. The young lady in turn cleared her throat. She coughed incessantly for some time. He looked at her in surprise and bewilderment. He asked if she was ill. The young lady looked away from him and said that she was just walking in the garden to get some fresh air. Michael slowly approached her and told her to sit still. She froze in bewilderment while he touched her forehead. He looked at her closely and said that fortunately she did not have a fever. A moment later, he pulled away from her and asked her to wait a little. Michael looked at the young lady and asked with a smile if she was not in the mood to eat in front of those with whom she was in a quarrel. She froze in shock and wondered if he could understand her. He sighed heavily and said that he understood everything because he also wanted to get rid of those two. He sighed heavily and said that whether she was a member of their family or someone else, sometimes things do not go the way they want. Michael smiled and said that since his father had returned early, everything would end tomorrow. A moment later, he adjusted the bow on her head and looked at her with a smile. Sienna froze in surprise on the spot since this had never happened before. He said with a smile that now she looks better. As he left, he smiled at her and told her that she should rest more. She sat intently for a while and watched him go. She was shocked and wondered if 10-year-olds could even smile like that. She wondered if it was innate. The young lady woke up but felt something strange. She knew it was a trial day, but no one came to wake her up. She sighed heavily and wondered if she had gotten up too early. Sienna knew she was not a lady, so she had no servants. The young lady walked slowly to the door, knowing she had to get out, before Lady Deborah saw her sleeping in the small room again. She froze at the door when she realized it was locked. She was in shock because she did not understand why the door was not opening. She froze and listened to it because she realized that there was no one outside. She wondered if someone had deliberately closed the door so that she couldn't pass the test. The young lady sighed heavily as she raised that this was a classic and boring method when she was really 12 years old. Something like this had not happened many times. She sighed heavily and sat on the bed. She wondered what she should do since she needed to go out to follow her plan. Sienna sighed heavily since she knew that this was all happening again. She sighed heavily, knowing that when the time came, someone would definitely open it. She thought it could be Michael or someone else. She slowly lay down on the bed. A moment later, she heard someone calling her from outside the door. To her surprise, she realized it was Lady Deborah. She was surprised. A moment later, Lady Deborah burst into the room and anxiously asked the young lady if everything was all right. The head maid was very surprised and did not understand why the young lady was still in bed. She asked her if she really wanted to sleep some more. Sienna, in turn, sighed heavily. She looked at the head maid with puzzlement and said that there was nothing else she could do. The head maid was shocked because she saw that the young lady did not even try to call for help, and later she fell asleep. The head maid said that she was very worried about her. Sienna looked at her in surprise and asked if she was worried, because no one helped her. Deborah screamed that she had her. Deborah looked at the young lady in surprise and asked excitedly if she really thought that the countess had done it too, and that was why she had done nothing. She looked closely at the maid, because she knew that the servants had done all this, and she could have sent the servants away. The head maid looked at the young lady with worry because she did not answer her question. The young lady smiled and told her that she should go quickly, and also asked if it was too late. Deborah hurried after the young lady. She looked at her closely and asked her worriedly why she had not answered. Sienna ignored her question and asked the head maid if it would not be better to dress nicer today. Meanwhile, the Nakhtov reception had already taken place. The Duke sat quietly and waited for the young lady. He silently heard all the conversations. Michael was worried he didn't understand how she could be late on such a day. He was in shock and didn't understand why she wasn't coming. He wondered if something had happened. The madam looked at her daughter closely, with a smirk on her face, as she was glad that the young lady was not at her place. A moment later, a young lady entered the hall with the head maid. The head maid looked intently at the Duke and called him. Everyone present looked at the young lady with fury. They did not understand how she could have recognized such a ceremony. They said that it was simply absurd. The head maid quickly fell to her knees and told the Duke that it was her fault that the lady was late. She screamed that she took full responsibility. Looking at the Duke, the head maid said that the young lady had a reason to be late. He looked at the lady in surprise and asked what the real reason for her being late was. The maid hesitated for a moment, not knowing what to answer, but a moment later, she said angrily that the guest present was to blame. The countess and her daughter froze in place and turned pale in surprise. The countess rose with lightning speed and looking at the head maid asked if she was really talking about them now. Madame was furious and shouted that she did not think that the Duke's family could be so inhospitable. Deborah looked at the Duke intently and said that because of the unfortunate incident that happened yesterday, she personally invited the lady guest to come, and she watched for several days the servants who were assigned to serve the lady made her starve. The young lady looked at the head maid in surprise. She didn't understand what was happening. The Duke looked angrily at the head maid and asked if this was true. The young gentleman looked at his father and said that everything was correct. The Duke looked at his son in surprise. He looked closely at his father and said that the young lady said that she did not want trouble for others, so she kept it a secret. Everyone present began to whisper, as they were shocked and thought that the young lady was forced to starve. They saw that she was very thin. The countess looked closely at everyone present and said that this had nothing to do with them. Sienna froze in surprise as she saw that everyone immediately agreed with her. She thought that she was the head maid, simply wonderful. Deborah said that she immediately punished the servants after hearing about what happened, and today, she found that the young lady who was supposed to take part in the competition was locked in a small room. Everyone was shocked by what they heard. The men looked closely at the young lady, now realizing why she was late. The head maid sighed heavily and said that it was all her fault. She said it was one of the maids, but she had no reason to do that to the young lady. Sienna thought for a moment. The head maid sighed heavily and said that she had questioned the maid for this reason. The girl said that if the young lady could not come to the competition, then the countess would be the winner. With tears in her eyes, she said that they had promised to pay her 100 coins. The Duke looked at everyone present with anger and asked what they were talking about. The countess in turn shouted that this was not true. She was shocked and asked how she could do such a thing. The Duke sighed heavily and said that in that case, his maid had conspired with the countess to lie. He looked at the countess with fury and said that this was very interesting. The countess in turn, trembling with fear, said that this was unfair. The man looked intently at the Duke and asking for forgiveness, said that it was time for the ceremony. He looked at the Duke intently and said that he himself knew that the tests of this ritual could not be undone. He asked the Duke why they did not perform the ceremony first. The young master looked intently at everyone present and said that if this was a test, then the traitor must be exposed and punished. He looked at the countess and her daughter and said that the punishment after defeat would be more painful. They froze in place from shock and fear. The Duke looked at his son And without sighing heavily, I said that he was right. A moment later, he said that they could now begin the ritual. The Duke looked at those present with fury and said that if Isabel became the owner of Hezros today, their family would not be held responsible for it. The young lady froze in shock. A moment later, the man told the participants to come closer. The countess looked closely at her daughter and told her to take the test calmly. She said that the Duke misunderstood them and thought that they insulted his family. She looked intently at her daughter and said that if she showed her superiority over the orphan, then everything would be resolved. The young lady froze in shock. A moment later, the man called Isabel and said that it was time for her to go. She sighed heavily and knew what she had to do, as her mother had said. Isabel knew that she shouldn't be afraid. She knew that she just had to show all her abilities. She knew she had to forget about everything that concerned the damned orphan and deal with it. The young lady walked slowly. She was furious and did not understand how he dared to challenge her. The young lady sighed heavily. She felt as if today was the day of her death. She sighed heavily because she didn't know. She didn't want to go through the tests at all. She was in shock and didn't know what to do. Isabel turned around and looked at the young lady as she heard something said. She looked at her in confusion and asked what she was talking about. She was shocked and asked if it was true. The young lady in turn looked at her intently and froze in place. She did not understand what was happening. Goosebumps ran across her body. The man looked closely at the young ladies and said that it was time for them to begin. The objects in the Millennium Box chose their owner themselves, and this was invariable. He looked at them intently and said that if the artifact did not accept them, then they should agree with this. The man looked at them intently and asked if this was clear. The young ladies said in unison that they understood everything. He sighed heavily and said that this was very good. A moment later, he said that possessing Hezros meant that they were given the honor of becoming the protector of all humanity. He said that if they obtained it, it would become theirs in exchange for their mind and feelings. The contract would be made immediately upon recognition. He looked at them intently and asked if they were ready. The young ladies sighed heavily and a moment later said they were ready. The man sighed heavily and said that then they could start with Lady Isabel. He stepped aside a little and said that she should come forward. The lady slowly approached the altar where the necklace was. Everyone watched her closely. Isabel slowly touched the artifact, but it did not accept her and struck her. The man looked intently at the young lady and said that the test was over. The countess looked at the young lady as she did not understand why this had happened. She shouted at her daughter to try again. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she had not even touched the water and could try again. The man grabbed her by the shoulders and told her that her ordeal was over and she had to stop, and Isabel in turn shouted that this would not happen. He looked at her intently and shouted excitedly that she should go away. He begged her, but the young lady in turn pushed him away and quickly put her hand on the necklace as she wanted to try again. But a moment later, the same thing happened the first time. The young lady was in shock and screamed that this simply couldn't be happening. She was puzzled because she did not understand why everything happened like this. Madame looked at her daughter and called her. She looked at her daughter intently and worriedly and asked if she was okay. Isabel was in shock as she now understood that the Duke would not forgive them. A moment later, the man looked at the young lady and said that she should go on. Sienna in turn slowly approached the altar and looked intently at him. A moment later, she finally gathered her courage and quietly touched the water. Everyone froze in surprise and stared at the lady. Sienna also froze in surprise. She didn't understand what was happening. She was surprised because she knew that this was absolutely not like the last time. She understood that it was normal for nothing to happen. She was shocked and wondered if this was the day of her death. The head maid looked at the young lady closely, as she was very happy that everything was fine. She glanced sideways at the Duke and the young master. She knew that this was her destiny. She knew that if everything happened like this, she would not return to the past. She sighed heavily, as she was feeling very bored. She wondered if she could get her hands out of the water yet, but suddenly she froze as she heard someone's voice. He was telling her that she couldn't do it. She heard someone tell her that she should not leave. Sienna was taken aback and turned around to look at everyone present. She didn't understand what had just happened. She looked closely at her new relatives and wondered if she had imagined it. Michael looked closely at his brother and said with a smile that he should see that the young lady was very confident in herself. Asil looked at his brother and told him not to point fingers. She in turn sighed heavily. She knew that she had nothing to be proud of. She in turn simply lowered her hands into the water. She understood perfectly well that she was also withering. He asked in surprise what she was saying. He told her that she had not fallen through at all. The young lady froze in surprise and wondered if it was Hezros himself speaking to her now. He said that everything was correct, and he had been waiting for her for 2,000 years to become his first mistress. She quickly took her hands out of the water, knowing that this simply couldn't be happening. The man looked at the young lady with bewilderment as he did not understand her behavior. She was taken aback and said that her hands suddenly caught fire. She knew that her dream was not to protect humanity at all. She wanted to become a scientist. As she walked away from the altar, she pretended to say that she was in great pain. She smiled and said that it seemed that she had failed too. She asked for forgiveness from those present. But he was not going to give up. He shouted to the young lady and called her, while he stirred up the water, and splashes flew in all directions. Everyone present froze in shock, as they did not expect to see anything like this. A moment later, they saw the necklace rise and hover in the air. He looked at her with fury, and changing his appearance, said that he had not let her go at all. He was angry, and with the speed of lightning, he used his power. The man was shocked, because it was the first time he had seen the flame of purification. The young lady looked at the necklace in surprise, but she looked closely as she understood that this was the end for her. Asil and Michael Ono rose from their chairs. They were very worried about the young lady. The Duke in turn stopped them and told them to wait. The young lady stood motionless in one place as the fire enveloped her. She froze in surprise as she realized that the fire was not hot at all. A moment later, she looked at him and called his name. He looked at her closely and said that it was all true, and he recognized her immediately. She looked at him intently and told him to calm down a little, since she could not be blown away. She looked at him in surprise and said that she had not told him at all that she would become his mistress. He was very angry with her and asked if she really thought he would ask her opinion on this matter. She looked at him intently and said that a contract creates an agreement between the parties. She asked if she thought it was correct. He sighed heavily and said that they knew this, but he had heard something about it. He said that besides, she was not the first chosen one he had met. He asked if she really thought that was his name. She was surprised that he had another name. She looked at him intently and said excitedly that she had never seen anyone like him and knew nothing about him. He looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. He quickly started flying around her and said that it was very strange. He said that he could not understand it, but it was wrong. He looked at her intently and asked why they didn't make a contract in that case. He looked at the young lady in surprise and asked why she decided so. She looked at him in surprise and bewilderment, as she did not understand why she saw two Hazaros at once. He excitedly shouted for her to speak faster. She hesitated as if she felt bad. At the same time, he shouted. He asked in surprise if this was her first discovery. He shouted that she should get up. The first magic that a young sorcerer unconsciously uses is called the first discovery. During the first discovery, it becomes clear what kind of sorcerer a person will become. At this point, it is important to record the amount and type of force, because many people only imitate them. The man smiled and said that they could not say for sure whether they had seen the young lady's magic. He said that the first discovery was the fire of Hezros, which cleared the entire area. He said that now she owns it and will be a wonderful mistress. The knights looked intently at the young lady. They did not understand how one could be so sweet. The Duke, in turn, looked intently at the lady who was sleeping quietly. Michael looked at her with fury. She was not theirs, as she knew that just an hour ago they had all criticized her. The young master said that the conductors were unique and rare. Michael looked at his brother and asked if they were the only ones who prevented cheating among sorcerers. Asil sighed heavily and said that this was exactly the case, since magic protects the conductors, and this is the most powerful type of magic. He looked closely at the young lady as he understood that this was simply amazing. He wondered if he had ever felt peace in the castle. He knew that the guides could influence nature. The cleansing also kept the land alive. He knew that it brought with it an early spring. He was puzzled and knew that he would never forget that cold spring. Michael looked closely at the young lady and asked when she would wake up. The Duke said she fainted when they started congratulating her. Michael sighed heavily and lay down quietly next to the young lady. He was furious because the inattentive aristocrats were talking so loudly that it was impossible to rest. The man looked sharply at the Duke and said that they were heading to the negotiation room. He said that he would prepare the case of the countess's family. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and said that they all believed, and now she could open her eyes. A moment later, The young lady obediently carried out the order. Michael looked at her in surprise and asked if she had not been asleep. Michael looked at his brother in surprise and asked if it was really the one who knew about this. The young master did not answer him. She sighed heavily and said that there were a lot of people. The Duke looked at her closely and said with a smile that everything was fine and it was worth it. He looked at her intently and asked if she realized that she was now the heroine of the day. She sighed heavily, but did not answer his question. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and, breathing heavily, said that she should rest first. The young lady lay quietly in bed, wondering if she understood what had just happened. She sighed heavily. Of course, she knew perfectly well what she had done. A moment later, she heard a voice telling her that he had had enough. He said angrily that such words were the least she deserved. The young lady opened her eyes in surprise and saw him in front of her. He sighed heavily and asked if she had just realized it was him. He laughed and said that for the first time in many years, he was not pretending to be a necklace. He sighed heavily and said that now a mountain had fallen from his shoulders. Sienna looked at him and said that he was just a thief. He looked at her in surprise, as he did not understand what he had managed to steal. She said that he had forced her to lose consciousness and sign a one-sided agreement. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. He said that she didn't know anything. He asked if she put her hands in the water. He said it was an ancient rite of forgiveness for the contract. He said she had already taken an oath to be pure before the contract. He looked at her intently and said that it was she who had asked him to make a contract with her, and for this reason he had agreed. The young lady looked at him in surprise and still said that it was theft. He looked at her intently and said that in any case, the contract was made and there was nothing he could do about it. She looked at him intently and realized that he had not chosen a master for a long time. She realized that he was very selective. She was puzzled because she saw that he was very stubborn. She understood that she needed to be vigilant, and it would be better to ask for something else. She poked him with her finger and asked what would happen if she scratched him. He hesitated, not knowing what to answer. A moment later, he said with a smile that of course she could do it. He smiled and said that it was an anniversary gift. She sighed heavily as she realized that she had never asked him about this. She knew that he was inattentive. He looked at her and said that since she had demonstrated her great magic, no one would treat her as they pleased anymore. He said that he didn't know that this was her first discovery, so he used a lot of force. She looked at him in surprise and asked if that was the reason she fainted. He looked at her closely and said that everything went great anyway, and everyone liked hers. After asking for forgiveness, she said that she did not want to be his mistress. He looked at her in surprise as he did not expect this. A moment later, he said she was lying. Sienna looked at him sharply and said it was true. If she had possessed powerful magical power in her past life, all of it would have been taken away by her adopted sister. She knew that she would no longer give in to her, but now she just wanted to live a quiet life. He looked at her in surprise and asked if this was true. She looked at her intently and said that everything was correct. He asked if she was really refusing. Sienna looked at him in surprise and asked if she could really break the contract. She was very interested in this question, as she hoped that she could still break off her relationship with him. He looked at her intently and said that she could not do anything like that. He shouted that she shouldn't even dream about something like that. He told her that their relationship was bound by a universal agreement. She was shocked because she didn't expect to hear something like that. He looked at her intently and asked if it was a sting when he trembled. With the speed of lightning, he sank into her arms. She looked at him intently and said that he turned her dreams to ashes. He sighed heavily and said that it was all for her success. He was surprised that she criticized him. He looked at her intently and asked if she knew that there was a dirty man walking next to her. He said that it was the countess and her daughter. He sighed heavily and said that her personality had changed a lot since she started using magic. She looked at him in surprise as she didn't understand what he was talking about. She sighed heavily as she understood perfectly well that nothing less was expected from them. At the same time in the audience hall, the countess was crying and saying that she really was not guilty of anything. She was in shock and didn't understand why everything ended this way for them. She was accused of insulting the young lady, trying to poison her, and even locking her in a room. The countess was shocked because her daughter did not become a protector. She accepted that if that girl had not come, then everything would have been fine. However, when they saw the flame, the spirit suddenly purified everyone. She was confused and did not understand what happened to her. She understood that she had really done bad things, so she had to be punished for it. The Duke looked closely at the countess and asked what she had just said. The countess looked at the duke with puzzlement, as she knew that he was a judge, appointed by the emperor himself. She knew that he could judge for himself. She was in shock, because she understood that he could punish them. She lowered her gaze to the floor with tears in her eyes, because she understood that he could punish Isabel. She was trembling. A moment later, she screamed that her daughter had done nothing. She screamed that it was all her fault. The duke looked at her and told her to stop. He said that she wanted to harm the child he was in charge of. He looked at them intently and said that the court had made its decision. He slowly walked closer to them and said with fury that they deserved to be executed since their family spared no one. The countess was in shock. She did not want this at all. She screamed and begged for leniency. A moment later, a young lady burst into the room and asked them to stop. The duke looked at the young lady in surprise, as he did not expect to see something like this. Assel was shocked. He didn't understand who dared to let the child into the hall. The knights hesitated, not knowing what to answer. The young lady quickly said that she had something to say, and for this reason, she forced the knights to let her in. The young lady bowed before them and asked them not to scold the knights. Assel looked at the young lady in surprise, as he did not expect such a thing. All those present looked closely at the young duke. As they saw that he was hesitating, they said that this was expected from the mistress of Hazeros. Meanwhile, the duke stopped and did not take action. She looked intently at the duke, who was very angry. The young lady in turn froze in place and was taken aback. She remembered how you, in your past life, pointed spears at her. She remembered how she was also in a similar situation. She screamed that it was not her fault. She said that traces of magic were on her sister. She remembered her sister screaming that she couldn't do this to her. She remembered how they all looked at her with contempt and said that she was a traitor. They said that she should go to prison. The duke called the young lady. She was taken aback and threw all her memories away. He looked at her intently and asked what she wanted to say. She sighed heavily, knowing that she needed to calm down and not get caught up in her memories. She looked at the duke intently, because she understood that she had to do what she came for. She looked at the duke intently and said that the countesses had been deceived, and that was why they had done such a thing. The countess looked at the young lady in surprise, not understanding what was happening. Sienna said that Hazeros had told her everything. They began to whisper, as they now realized that the mother and daughter had behaved abnormally. Then they said that if Hazeros said so, then they were possessed. Those present were surprised and did not understand what was going on at all. The man looked closely at the young lady and said that fortunately she appeared on time. He said that if it weren't for the young lady, the mother and daughter would have completely gone crazy. The duke looked closely at everyone present, but said nothing. Sienna sighed as she knew that he really existed, and she would have to use him if something happened. Assel looked intently at the young lady and asked with bewilderment why she had come to save the countess and her daughter. He looked intently at the young lady and asked with bewilderment why she had decided to stand up for the countess and her daughter. She looked at him and said that she was fascinated by their scam because their threats were undoubtedly a sin. She said that she had no intention of saving them at all, and she could not do it. Hesitating, she said that hiding the truth was also considered a lie. She looked at the duke intently and said that it could be concluded that she was not an orphan. The duke froze in place in surprise. He looked intently at the countess and her daughter and said that he would now make a new decision. The great mines in the north belonged to the count. He also owned half the shares of the Untamed, all of which passed into the possession of Sienna, the mistress of Hasaros. The young man looked at the young lady and said that this was her agreement. She was surprised and did not understand why they did something like that. The young man smiled and said that the duke had acted generously and the incident had been resolved by compensation. The count thanked the young lady for her mercy and promised to pay everything back. Then, the count decided to pay the victim every penny of compensation. The young lady looked at Sienna, intently bowed, and said that she would not forget her grace. The ore they were offering wasn't just any precious stone. It was a special kind of stone that could be engraved with magical spells, and it was mined in the very mine the young lady now had. The young man looked at the young lady intently and asked if she knew about the essence stone. She looked at him closely and said that she knew about it and had studied it. She said that this is the use of mana to avoid fraud, and it is a very important stone. Assel said that it is called a magic stone. The duke looked closely at the young lady and said that she probably did not yet understand the value of this mine. She was very angry because they had just explained everything to her so clearly. She wondered why she should not understand something like that. She knew that Isabel was jealous of her adopted sister and ended up losing the war with her. Now she understood perfectly well that this compensation should have gone to the young lady. She sighed heavily because she knew that if they robbed her, then who knew what would happen next. The young master looked at her intently and said that if she wanted to become a famous sorceress, she would need to disguise herself well. He said that she should accept the mine. She looked at them intently and said that they could take the mine themselves instead of her. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said that she was no longer an orphan. He said that she was already the owner of Hezeros. She couldn't understand at first that besides the privilege, the owner of Hezeros also had responsibilities. He looked at her intently and said that she should listen to him carefully. The Duke said that if she wanted to refuse responsibility, she could do so. She looked at him in surprise as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She was shocked and did not understand what he was talking about because she thought that she needed to be responsible. She wondered if she could really live as she wanted. She sighed heavily and said that others would still be watching her. He looked at her with an intent gaze and said that she did not need to pay attention to other people's words at all. He looked at her intently and said that he was a duke and guaranteed to grant her such freedom, and he himself could not violate it. He looked at the young lady intently and said that she should never again say that she was an orphan. He said that she was now part of their family. She sighed heavily because she did not expect him to say such words. She could not forget the whole past. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she understood everything. She said that he himself had just told her that she could live freely. The young lady said that she would definitely think about it. The Duke looked at her intently and said that she could now go and rest. He looked closely at the young lady as he realized that after what she had said, she looked more alive. But he saw the look of regret on his son's face. She sighed heavily as she thought it was unfair that the life she remembered had become impossible. She was puzzled as she now realized that she was too obsessed with her memories. She was puzzled and wondered if she could forget everything like this. She heard their voices everywhere. They were screaming that she should rot in the dungeon. She heard the words of her sister, who told her so that she hated her so much that she wanted to kill. She was in shock and wondered if she could start this life with a completely clean slate. She sighed heavily as she realized that it was simply impossible. Sienna knew that without remorse or an apology, there could be no forgiveness. She knew she would have to live with these memories for the rest of her life. She greeted them in a way they had not seen in a long time. The young man sighed heavily and said that if the share in the mine was divided, the Count's family would own the ruins. He said that he would prepare to attend the New Year's reception as a representative of the Bonchen family. A seal looked intently at everyone present and said that although the compensation had been paid, it was not the end. He said that their poison had harmed the magical power they were seeking. He was very glad that Lady Deborah had not told the young lady about this, but unfortunately, the poisoner was unknown. He sighed heavily and said that they needed to find the culprit as soon as possible. He knew that there was a possibility that this was just preparation for unrest. The Duke looked closely at his son and said that this could be a correct assumption. He sighed heavily and said that they needed to investigate everything thoroughly. The young man sat quietly in the room. He looked around intently and wondered if he was really sitting in his own room. He realized that the room was very dark and the interior had been slightly changed. A moment later, he felt someone's presence. The young man came into the room. He was very angry and shouted that he was so ridiculous. He was furious because he couldn't even cope with his job. The young man looked at the young man in surprise, as he did not understand who was in the room. The young man was furious. He shouted that he simply did not want to see that face. He was furious and did not understand at all why his father had brought the child to their estate. The young man watched the young man with a close gaze. He did not understand what was happening. He froze in surprise as he could not move at all. The young man screamed with rage. He said that this was the end, but he did not understand why everything was happening like this. The young man froze in shock. He realized who was standing in front of him. A moment later, he saw the young man's face clearly. He saw his angry gaze. He wondered if it was really him. Sometime later, he woke up from a terrible nightmare and screamed involuntarily. The maid looked at the young lord in surprise and asked if he was all right. She quickly ran up to him and said that he was just in a cold sweat. He looked at her in surprise and asked worriedly if he had slept. She was excited and asked him to wait a little. She rushed to the door and said that she would immediately bring him a towel and new clothes. For a moment, he stood frozen in place and wondered what the young man had been talking about in his dream. He was puzzled because he did not remember anything. He felt uneasy and was overcome with anxious feelings. The teacher looked closely at the young lady with a smile, congratulated her on becoming a protector. He smiled and gave her a small bouquet of flowers. He happily said that she had given them an early spring and should accept the gift from him. The beautiful spring she had called upon was already gone when she woke up. She sighed heavily, as she couldn't even see it. Hesor smiled and said that a small gift would be nice too. The young lady thanked the teacher with a smile. The teacher looked closely at the young lady as he realized that such a small gift made her shine so radiantly. The Duke made a wise decision. The knight looked at the Duke closely and asked if he would throw them a party where they would announce that the lady had become a protector. The Duke sighed heavily and said that they would not arrange anything. He also said that they should temporarily forbid everyone from talking about her being a protector. They were surprised and did not understand why he decided this. They knew that this was very good news. He looked at everyone present and said that the young lady had not yet had time to get used to life as Nick's daughter. He said that he was forbidding any personal meetings for now. After leaving the Duke's office, they were heatedly discussing that the rumors about the Duke caring very much about the young lady were true. After all, they said that the Count's family had caused a very big commotion and they had learned their lesson. The man said that harming the protector was a serious crime and a threat to the imperial family. His friend said that the point was that she was not allowed to know something. The man said that the young lady had forgiven them, which meant nothing more would happen to them. The man said with a grin that everything was exactly like that, but in turn he knew perfectly well that of course they would be punished. The deceitful vassals did not stand aside. Toys, various ornaments, jewelry, expensive textbooks, and gifts with impure intentions. Everything was intended for the young lady. The teacher was very surprised that all the gifts were for the lady. The headmaid sighed heavily and said that it would be great if it were always like this, but unfortunately, the Duke ordered all the gifts to be returned. The teacher looked at all the gifts in surprise and asked if this was true. The maid said that the young lady would not have seen these gifts anyway. He looked at her lady's sore throat and said with a smile that they could begin the lesson. He smiled and said that since she had become a protector, when she turned 10, she would have to enter the academy. He said that in order to prepare for the future, he would teach her the basics. She looked closely at the teacher because she knew that the military academy was what she needed. The teacher froze in place with happiness as he saw the pose of readiness. He was in shock as a diligent and exemplary student was now sitting in front of him. He said that she would understand the main role of a defender from the exercises, and today he would talk about the barrier glaciers form, the main barrier, the area surrounded by. It is called a territory. The more capable the defender, the larger the territory, and all barriers are classified by size. He looked at the young lady and asked how big the territory would be. Sienna thought about it and asked if she could capture her and the other sorcerers. He looked at her with a smile and said that she was very simple. The teacher said that such a territory could surround the Duke's estate. She was surprised and did not expect to hear such a thing. He looked closely at the young lady and said that everything is so, and the more experienced wizard, the larger the territory. After a long talk of new information, he said with a smile that the lesson was over for today. He smiled and said that since she had listened to him very carefully, there would be no homework. He looked closely at her and the copied notebook and said that she looked beautiful. He looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if something was wrong. She thought for a moment and said that the exercises were very interesting. The teacher froze in shock. He didn't expect to hear something like that at all. Memories of the old days came flooding back to him. Because of one mistake, Lord Assel was starting to get angry at him, and teaching the unbearable Michael was tiring. He was amazed that now he had just an angel and not a student. He looked closely at the young lady as he wanted her to always be by his side and studied diligently. He looked at her intently and asked how a student could give meaning to a teacher's work. She smiled and said that his lessons were very interesting. He smiled and said that he would definitely give her a lot of exercise. The young lady thanked him with a smile. He looked at her closely and asked with a smile what she would like to decide for herself. She smiled and said that she would like whatever he offered her. Michael sauntered into the room where the young lady was studying. He looked at them closely and wondered if they were crazy. The headmaid said he had expressed himself a bit rudely. He was surprised that they were so fond of exercise. He said it was simply abnormal. Michael looked at them intently and sighed heavily, saying that it turned out they needed to call a doctor sooner. Madame smiled and said that they just liked to study. The madam looked at the young lady intently and said that even if that was true, It was the first time she had seen the young lady smile so radiantly. Michael looked away from the young lady, embarrassed, and said that was not bad. She looked at the young gentleman intently and said that she would prepare dinner for the lady and lord, and perhaps they could become friends. Michael looked at Deborah in surprise and asked if she had gone crazy too. The young gentleman looked at the lady intently and asked why she did not eat rice. He was surprised that she did her homework while eating and slept at the table. He looked at her intently and said that she should wake up as they wanted to go for a walk after dinner. She looked at the young gentleman in surprise and asked where he would like to go for a walk. He smiled and said that since she was awake, they could go shopping. He looked at her intently and asked if she wanted it. The young lady had something completely different in mind, and she didn't know what to answer. She looked at him intently and wondered why she felt like, if she agreed seeing his mischievous smile, she would lose to him.